plump lad twirled the blade ferociously. He no longer wished to be overlooked, yet in a fleeting instance of negligence, he stumbled over his own bulk, and the blade concluded, puncturing his abdomen. This is the manner in which bariatric surgery was developed. He did not perish, or perhaps he did. However, that plump posterior shell transform into an unrelenting and enormously powerful royal. He will pummel his sibling mercilessly, and perhaps even become committed to a captivating millennium-old elf. In addition to being stunning, she is an individual among, if not the most formidable individual throughout the entire realm. Following that day with the blade, he transformed entirely, and you are curious to find out the reason? The central character of this narrative was the blade that pierced the youth and not the plump one. It possessed numerous proprietors for centuries. It was the blade that shaped the champions who became integral to the narratives of the world. And throughout the journey, he formed a companionship, a lad brought into existence in a secluded hamlet with the family name Leanberger. In unison, they accomplished a feat that no one else had achieved. They vanquished a colossal serpent from the icy peaks. Subsequently, Leanberg ascended to the throne of the nation. In the meantime, Gruen, the famed sword renowned for vanquishing dragons, was set aside, accompanied by his companion's plea to safeguard his lineage. That is when he roused from slumber. From his slumber, some fool was twirling him about. The stout individual exclaimed that starting today, he would be the expert of the blade, and subsequently brandished it forcefully. However, Gruen, upon employing his skill, became aware that he was indeed an offspring of his companion. Although he resembled a swine that ambles on two limbs, the corpulent individual solely sought acknowledgement from the aristocrats and perhaps to have the capacity to replenish his lunch exceeding 8 occasions. He believed he could achieve that with Gruen's power. However, following a few minutes of wielding the blade, he stumbled over his own bulk and tumbled. The issue lies in the fact that he never envisioned this to be the blade that would carry out a weight loss surgical procedure on him. Descendant of Gruen's companion, or, however, we must acknowledge that this individual has truly earned the distinction of the most foolish I have ever encountered. He also remained. They're attributing fault to the blade. Nobody desired him as the prospective monarch due to his avarice and hubris. This was the insatiable and foolish Prince Adrian Leanberger. However, everything began to transform after he pierced himself with a blade. Whispers swiftly circulated that he had ceased toppling and shattering the dining table and had stopped associating with outlaws. However, within his chamber, the reflections varied. Gruen was astonished to discover that he had slain his companion's progeny and seized control of his corpse. Regardless of his preference, now he had transformed into the defiant prince. Along with a swine as well, we mustn't overlook that. The domestic worker, alerted that his superior had arrived to see him, yet he became irate over it as the superior had not visited previously. Conversely, regarding the master, he came to understand that despite nearly perishing, the prince remains unchanged. He merely arrived to carry out his responsibility as a leader. Yet the plump individual is completely unaware of his own identity and ultimately utilized the incident as a justification to state that he suffers from memory loss. Abruptly, the retainers proclaimed that the sovereign has appeared. The patriarch of the swine made his entrance into the venue. Adrian is astonished due to the monarch appears more formidable than he envisioned. The monarch believed he was identical as well, given that he failed to acknowledge him upon his arrival. Nonetheless, it is widely claimed that Adrian has forfeited his recollections. Shortly, the physician arrived to assess him. There is nothing physically amiss with him apart from the 300 pounds of adipose tissue. Perhaps it is merely a transient manifestation resulting from emotional trauma. The monarch merely declares that this is excessively advantageous. It's not as though all of his actions would simply vanish due to his memory lapse. Naturally, he will remain confined within the fortress for some time because, concerning this, he must be confined and refrain from consuming food to determine if he sheds pounds. Regardless, he was eager to discover what that individual had accomplished, and at that precise instant, his mother embraces Adrian, expressing that he must feel quite bewildered, yet his recollection should be restored shortly. Certainly, absent, you could instantly perceive the disparity in the way the father and the mother were treated, my friend. And then she remarks that she is delighted to witness him stirring awake in this manner. In any case, you should refrain from handling perilous objects again, since she is uncertain about what actions she might have taken had he not regained consciousness. However, my dear friend, unfortunate soul, she remains oblivious to the fact that her son has already passed away. There's nothing that can be accomplished at this moment, is there? A short while later, his mother mentions that she will come to see him, then advises him to ensure he gets ample rest for the time being. Adrian was attempting to comprehend all that had transpired, contemplating that that his companion had implored him extensively to safeguard his offspring, yet he ultimately resulted in the demise of one. And although it was not deliberate, he nonetheless committed the act. Given that it occurred, and there is nothing that can be changed, therefore he will thrive for his own benefit. Previously, he was reborn as a blade and dedicated his existence to rectifying the blunders of others, and now he finds himself in a corpulent physique devoid of skill. However, that is inconsequential, as he merely needs to resort to sheer strength once more, since he had previously instructed a group of youngsters. Ultimately, it is essential to enhance the mana core. Moreover, suddenly, the individual inhales deeply, sensing his mana core. Simultaneously, the enchantment unravels, and the plump youngster becomes aware that mana circulates, yet regrettably, his physique cannot manage it. He endeavors to repeat the same action multiple times, but regrettably, nothing functions. Curious about what type of physique that was, if he possessed his original form, he could compel the mana into it. Immediately thereafter, a servant enters declaring that this is an extraordinary elixir dispatched by the monarch. The woman appeared rather displeased, contemplating that she wished he wouldn't hurl the cup once more. At that instant, our lad is astonished as he comprehends that there was essence in that vessel as well, and without idling away the hours, the child begins consuming the medication. The domestic worker is astonished due to the lad had truly consumed every last drop. Subsequently, the main character invokes his mana core once again, contemplating. Fortunately, that had succeeded. Indeed, it remains exceedingly insufficient and will vanish within a day. However, certainly that will only transpire if he permits it, inquiring of the housekeeper if there is an additional supply of that medication. With that, several days elapse, and the main character was elated, as he was at last going to have the opportunity to forge a mana core. He had performed this numerous times previously, and unexpectedly, the child begins to experience discomfort in his physique. Abruptly, a recollection emerges, and Idrian recollects that forging a mana heart was consistently accompanied by excruciating agony. To exacerbate the situation, he cannot succumb to unconsciousness, as if he were to faint in that place, the mana would revert its course. At that moment, the child focuses even more intently the procedure of crafting the mana core. Shortly thereafter, he appeared to have attained his desires. With all matters resolved, Idrian believes that this is not an object he created for another individual, but rather a mana core that belongs solely to him. At that precise instant, a system dialog box emerges, notifying him that the purported mana heart had ultimately been developed. Idrian believes that this resembles the status updates he used to convey to his masters when he was a blade, pondering why it had manifested before him at this moment. Simultaneously, a series of system notifications emerge, indicating that the link to the source is being re-established. And although he was acquiring certain enhancements, there were also some abilities that remained inaccessible. He begins to survey his surroundings, becoming aware that his eyesight had enhanced. The same applies to his auditory organs, as he is capable of perceiving the noise emanating from beyond the entrance as well. Abruptly, our lad senses an emotion, and the system alerts that all the mana within his being has been depleted. Idrian believes that he has now grasped what constrained him as a result of that unparalleled sword awareness that discerned everything in every direction without any blind spots is no longer present, and at present, with merely a minimal expenditure of mana, he is able to perceive sounds beyond the door or gain a clearer view of his surroundings. However, if he enhances his mana capacity, there ought to be some alteration, wouldn't there? Yet there is. There's no method to accomplish that at this moment, particularly since he was famished and the plump child could no longer endure it. Initially, first and foremost, he must acclimate to the experience of being human. Furthermore, shortly thereafter, the child's mother was delighted that he had consumed all the medication without leaving a trace. Additionally, that he was appreciating his own physique, and at that precise instant, an individual materializes. His mother inquires whether he recognizes that person, and responses indicate that the lad truly appears to have forgotten his past. The sovereign claims that this is the reason her sibling ought to assist that youngster, as he is, after all, his sole nephew, correct? Furthermore, upon examining the circumstances, Idrian concludes that merely glancing at him reveals his disfavor. Additionally, the gentleman asserts he will clarify this immediately, that the sole action he can take is to assist him in shedding some of that excess weight. He is incapable of accomplishing anything further, so he ought not to raise his expectations, and the queen asserts that this is already sufficient. Furthermore, shortly thereafter, my companion, the main character, was enduring hardship and undergoing rigorous training. His uncle asserts that henceforth, consuming food and beverages, as well as even inhaling, requires his consent. Moreover, if he anticipates royal treatment, he ought to abandon that expectation immediately. The sole option available to him is to exert considerable effort, and if he alters offers his perspective. He may even impart some of his family's clandestine sword-fighting techniques. Upon listening, naturally, the boy was incensed, as he desired to instruct the mentor who had trained the unbeatable knight and the master of the nation's founding monarch. And if that is true, then they ought to place a wager. In 6 months, he will compel him to recognize his presence, believing that he must shatter that haughty demeanor once and for all. Should he falter, he will comply with any directive given to him, and conversely, if he prevails, he will be obliged to fulfill one of his desires. Upon hearing that, the elderly gentleman is taken aback, yet ultimately agrees, as he too requires something to engage his mind, doesn't he? In the meantime, Idrian believes he had articulated himself rather effectively, yet regrettably, that substantial physique proves unbeneficial. Possessing no alternative option, he will need to utilize mana, and initially, he must concentrate on incinerating the adipose tissue from his whole physique. The elderly gentleman continued observing all of that, and promptly strikes the child, inquiring if he had fashioned a mana core. With a grin upon his lips, he remarks that he accomplished it recently, inquiring whether he already feels remorse for his wager. However, in fact, the elderly gentleman inquires what thoughts crossed his mind to engage in such an action, yearning to understand where he acquired the skill to enhance a mana core, and seemingly he is unaware of his errors. Following. Indeed, the mana heart is a rudimentary skill that is exclusively mastered by 5th-tier mercenaries. And then, my companion, naturally, the child comprehended absolutely nothing, believing that this is unequivocally the final era, inquiring what he signifies by that, and the elderly gentleman states it's swifter to demonstrate it to him in person, advising him to observe attentively. Our young lad is astonished as he discovers that there is essentially mana in the form of a circle. Simultaneously, the energy intensifies, fracturing the main character's magical energy. The elderly gentleman then remarks that the mana current possesses the ability to obliterate the sword energy emanating from the mana heart. Furthermore, he adds that it is significantly simpler and more consistent than the mana heart. Even Count Eli's lineage, which was adamant about the mana heart, completely crumbled a century past, and presently, no one desires to wield that power any longer. Therefore, as time elapses, our young man immersed himself in various books, acknowledging that circumstances had indeed transformed. Wizards employ enchanted rings while knights intertwine currents to accumulate mana, and a knight's rank is classified based on the quantity of currents interlaced, spanning from a solitary current to a quintuple current. It doesn't appear to be anything that outrageous. Furthermore, as he persists in perusing the volume, he discovers a name referred to as Altringen. The young lad is astonished while pondering that ages ago an individual who employed an unusual method not characteristic of either a swordsman or even a sorcerer once sought him out. Frankly, he felt the name was quite recognizable, pondering what had transpired with him. Subsequently, the main character appeared to be preparing, and his uncle inquires whether he perused the novel the previous evening. This implies that by this point, he ought to have comprehended the circumstances and recognized the folly of his decision. And the child, brimming with assurance, asserts that he believes he has made no errors whatsoever. Not at all. Each mana core is identical, inquiring whether he has ever been aware of the distinction in tiers. His uncle inquires about the subject of his conversation, noting that among hired soldiers, there exist individuals similar to him. Essentially, they are individuals who deceive themselves into believing they are champions from centuries past, inquiring if he is aware of what transpired with all of them. They were unable to overcome even 2 currents and faced utter defeat. However, if the lad is distinct from those individuals, he must vanquish a dual current knight. Should he succeed, that he shall be his protector as his mother desires. And listening, that our protagonist inquires if having his uncle as his custodian would genuinely be a beneficial arrangement. That instant, all become quiet, and the uncle appeared to become slightly annoyed, stating that he holds the title of count within the realm and leads the northern forces. One of the 5 Argent Lions who accompany his majesty, the individual possesses a multitude of titles. He is also a 4-ring knight and possesses a few additional ones, but I'll only reference these as I'm feeling rather lethargic. And his name is Bael Valahard, and who precisely might have the authority to surpass him, inquiring if those credentials are sufficient as is. Furthermore, at that precise instant, the warriors elevate their blades, proclaiming, Valahard needs to take a step back. This individual is truly formidable. The pair of them remains upright. They're gazing intently at one another, and a brief time later, the main character was utterly exhausted, and his uncle remarked that it was sufficient for the day. Moments later, our protagonist was strolling through the fortress, contemplating. He had nearly faced death. Subsequently, he unlocks a portal, and an individual states that he had been anticipating his arrival. Idrian recollects that he serves as the royal medic, and the individual expresses expresses uncertainty about how to assist his esteemed lord, recalling someone so modest. Regardless, he seeks to understand the purpose of his visit, and the doctor informs him that the queen commanded him to employ restorative sorcery on him. He casts the enchantment. However, Idrian, without delay, promptly ejects the individual from his chamber, stating that this essentially discards all of today's hard work. In the meantime, a chevalier observed all of Idrian's actions and appeared rather astonished. Correct? At that very instant, a child swings the door ajar, inquiring whether his sibling is present. He gazes at the main character, and in the meantime, the imp was consuming, desiring to ascertain the identity of that fool. Moreover, subsequently, the warrior beside him murmurs into his ear that it was the third royal. Indeed, subsequently, the polished individual remarks that he learned about an incident he endured, but regrettably, it appears he was in better condition than he had presumed. The main character remarks that it appears the prince has no other pursuits, inquiring whether he arrived solely to taunt him. Curse it, he's truly eager for a confrontation. At one point, the prince becomes infuriated, believing that he is merely a fool who has plunged a blade into his own flesh. Noting that he came across some intriguing information. Supposedly, he placed a wager with Count Valahard and is even set to engage in a duel with a double current knight. Furthermore, if that is the situation I desired, to ascertain if I might be your adversary. Whoa, the atmosphere is beginning to intensify. Shortly thereafter, Idrian found himself pondering what had just transpired, and if all of Leon Berger's progeny were similarly inclined. Abruptly, the knight proclaims that Prince Gilliam has been renowned for his skill with the blade since his youth. Ultimately, possessing 2 rings at merely 14 years of age is a remarkable accomplishment. At that precise instant, a servant enters, announcing that a few correspondences have arrived for him. The child was completely oblivious to the situation, and subsequently, as he gazes at the correspondence, each and every one of them is an invitation to challenge the lad to a duel. Following that, it's an opportunity to confront that fool within the bounds of the law, isn't it? Certainly, our lad wasn't going to yield, and summoning the servant, he inquired her to document the names of all those individuals. Moments later, the main character was practicing, and his uncle instructed him to grasp the sword. To begin with, he must understand at least the fundamental concepts for the wager to be valid, and he wishes to avoid hearing justifications later regarding losses attributed to a lack of knowledge about the essentials. Acknowledging, in light of that, Idrian retrieves the blade from the earth, yet he promptly senses something. Additionally, my companion, that's referred to as muscular discomfort. The uncle is astonished, inquiring whether he had not been bestowed with restorative enchantment. Yet, subsequently, the main character asserts that, as a knight, he ought to be acutely aware that, if he obtained that, his muscles would merely revert to their previous state and would not increase in size. Listening, Valahard merely acknowledges it quietly and subsequently grasps the sword, stating that he will not demonstrate it frequently. Therefore, he must remain vigilant. This is the instructional approach that the realm's warriors adopt when establishing their groundwork. Subsequently, he commences to exhibit the skill of sword fighting with all his expertise. The individual truly is exceptional. The main character can merely observe in astonishment, pondering. At this moment, he remarked that this is the technique of swordplay the realm's warriors acquire while establishing their groundwork. Valahard indicates that, as it is a sword technique devoted to the fundamentals, there is no superior martial art to initiate with, and taking into account his skill, which is already quite sufficient. Upon hearing that, the main character promptly bursts into laughter, reflecting on that, regardless of how much time had elapsed, that skill in swordplay that vanquished the frenzied dragon, being regarded as a method of instruction, was remarkable. Subsequently, his uncle asserts that, naturally, that in itself won't suffice to secure the wager. Thus, after grasping the fundamentals, he must request his mother to engage another instructor. However, the lad responds that it's unnecessary. He isn't going to master another sword technique after all. This one is sufficient, isn't it? Upon hearing that, the man is astonished, yet claims he is free to act as he pleases. Squandering moments, our protagonist embarks on training, believing that it was remarkable for the contemporary dragon-slaying blade to be regarded as a trivial practice sword. Truthfully, he is reluctant to acknowledge it, yet it is an inherent occurrence, as within that dragon-slaying blade, the determination to vanquish dragons resides inside it. They merely forsook the mana core, and for those who have neglected the art of imbuing a blade with intent, there exists no means for them to discern the genuine worth of the dragon-slaying sword. At that precise instant, Valahard unsheathes his blade, obstructing the main character's rebellion, stating, merely exerting force in your arm does not guarantee that power transfers to the blade. At the very least, he is instructing him correctly, isn't he? He indicates, detailing the components of the young man's physique, highlighting that he must utilize power appropriately across his entire physique to handle the sword effectively. Upon hearing this, this, the young lad merely rises again, contemplating that although this form was now a frail vessel that could scarcely replicate the counterfeit dragon-slaying blade, he would demonstrate firsthand that it was not a blade to be discarded as if it were insignificant. Thus, my companion, the days elapsed, and occasionally weeks, with a month elapsed, and the system manifests, indicating that following intense training, he succeeded in transforming his physique. The characteristic of extreme corpulence shifted to typical overweightness, and his metabolic rate became increasingly vigorous with the alteration in constitution, acclimating to utilizing the body in consistent exercise. Gradually, the individual is going to begin developing a physique akin to that of a tank. My companion contemplates that he is handling the sword with greater ease than he did a month prior. Furthermore, evidently growing increasingly formidable with every day that goes by. Yet, at that precise instant, his enraged uncle asserts that he had previously instructed him to cease. The lad's blade drops to the earth, and, subsequently, that uncomfortable stillness lingers in the atmosphere. The main character's hand was already oozing blood from extensive training. Subsequently, his uncle advances, and Idrian, glancing at the accompanying musician, the training mannequin had been utterly obliterated. It appeared as though a bolt of lightning had hit amidst the downpour. Subsequently, his uncle remarks that had it been a genuine sword, he would not have evaded that mishap. The child merely absorbs everything in quietude, and observing his hand, it was utterly calloused. At that precise instant, the system materializes, notifying him that he has attained a level of intense focus. Instantaneously, he falls inert to the earth, and Valahard simply observes his nephew, remarking that he is a fool, and gradually, he is gaining the man's esteem. After some time, our protagonist had already roused from slumber, acknowledging that he had fainted. Regardless, previously, he was unaware of the boundaries of that physique. A blade, he had already attained every conceivable achievement, having been brandished by numerous champions. He ushered conflicts to triumph, and enhanced the stature of both physique and spirit, and directed the course of all those individuals. His designation was Gruen, and he served as a sagacious counselor and an outstanding instructor. Yet, in any event, his presence had perpetually been merely that of an outsider. This is the reason he continued to wield his blade until he arrived at that moment, consumed by the sensation of claiming the perspiration, the toil, and all the outcomes as exclusively his. If this persists, this frail physique will eventually shatter. Thus, he must harmonize all aspects. Correct? It has already been a month since he formed his mana core, and he has gathered mana throughout this period. Therefore, he is now ready to advance to the subsequent phase. The lad subsequently starts to focus, and the system notifies him that following relentless practice, he has succeeded in amassing a particular degree of mana, and can now endure slightly more. Consequently, his mana core enlarges progressively, improving. The child awakens his gaze, and the outcomes of his training are gradually beginning to emerge. Immediately, naturally, the young man was preparing to seize his blade, and the system notifies him that he has attained the rank of sword novice. And furthermore, he has already mastered the fundamentals, as he is now proficient in utilizing aura at the most prevalent level. A brief time later, Idrian found himself at the training grounds when his uncle showed up, stating that the gossip was circulating across the realm. All credit goes to that infernal wager, inquiring whether it might be more advantageous to swiftly locate an adversary for a duel. Idrian asserts that regarding that matter, he has already made his choice about who it will be. Nonetheless, it will be challenging to confront a dual flow simultaneously, so it would be advisable to initially contend with individuals facing a single current. Agreed? Then, Idrian summons the knight adjacent to him, who claims he has already organized everything Idrian requested. Here is the compilation of challenge requests directed at him, and the gentleman inquires if he plans to conduct the practice duels. The majority of those individuals harbor resentment towards him, and might attempt to damage his reputation by exploiting the confrontation. However, our lad was already aware of that, my friend. Hence, his uncle will serve as the adjudicator. He isn't requesting anything so extravagant. He merely wishes for him to prevent anyone from perishing during the confrontation, inquiring if he could grant him that small kindness. Correct? Thus, a day elapses, and the time for the confrontation ultimately comes. The initial contender was already positioned at the castle entrance, contemplating that the illegitimate first prince was present. That the individual is named Taylor, and he is the younger son of a commonplace aristocratic household. However, several years prior, his progenitor and his sibling were affronted in an indelible manner by that individual. As a result, the family's reputation plummeted, and his father and brother have endured ridicule from the aristocrats even to this day. Furthermore, as a result, my companion, he intends to make Idrian suffer significantly for his actions that day, and then he addresses the prince, stating that his name is Taylor, and that he is a contemporary solitary knight, and Idrian states that there is no necessity for such excessive massive formality in a practice duel that isn't even sanctioned. Even thus, he is curious to ascertain if that individual is genuinely a knight, as he appears quite feeble. Immediately, Taylor becomes enraged, believing that, as the gossip suggests, this individual is quite conceited. At that precise instant, Val Hart materializes, expressing that he comprehends his emotions, yet the confrontation has not commenced, inquiring him to retract his presence, and that individual appeared to hold Val Hart in high regard, expressing that it is a privilege to encounter him. Observing that, Adrian remarks that it appeared as though he was the one being regarded like royalty, and his uncle suggests that he ought to have conducted himself more appropriately in everyday situations. Regardless, the confrontation is on the verge of commencing, and the pair gazes into one another's eyes. Taylor subsequently energizes his essence, and devoid of expending any moments, fees directly at our lad, who subsequently calls upon his mana core, achieving to thwart the assault. Taylor is astonished that Adrian is employing that particular fencing technique. Concurrently, he retreats. In astonishment, he states that a mana core is incapable of obstructing a mana flow, and Adrian inquires whether that is occurring solely due to his status as the Soul Knight presently. At that precise instant, all individuals is astonished by something, and Val Hart believes that this is the purported melody of the blade. In the meantime, Taylor was astonished that his assault had been thwarted, surging forward at Adrian once more. The youngster simply observes Taylor's actions, yet, regardless, hinders the assault once more. They remain in that position for some time until Taylor ultimately becomes fatigued. The lad was also gasping, contemplating that they claim present mana is the antithesis of the heart, and that assertion holds true. Frankly, it seems as though his mana is on the verge of reversing its course at any instant. Shifting the topic, he inquires whether he mentioned being the second offspring of Baron Talheim. Regardless, he must calm his thoughts, and, shutting his eyes, the lad descends into a stupor. He communicates something to Rouse, believing that the malevolent blade, or celestial blade, constitutes a fragment of his essence. Very well, that colossal dragon stirs to life, and Adrian believes that this is the blade's recollection and the core of the spirit, honed to vanquish dragons. Essentially, the genuine might of the dragon-slaying blade. Astonishingly, he is indeed succeeding in accomplishing that within a physique such as this. Simultaneously, that cherished force emerges to the forefront. Meanwhile, Taylor was attempting to comprehend the situation unfolding. At that precise instant, Val Hart instructs them to cease the combat. Yet, my companion, Adrian, disregarded all of that and dashed towards the boy. Suddenly, a recollection emerges featuring the main character expressing a desire to his uncle. It appears that he is poised to eliminate his adversary. Therefore, he must certainly prevent him. Additionally, that is precisely what occurred. My companion, the unfortunate main character, was cast far off. Val Hart was not present to engage in frivolity, and goodness, the child was utterly devastated on the floor. At that precise instant, all the troops subdue the individual, stating that his recent actions could, contingent upon the situation, be deemed an attempt on the life of a member of the royal family. However, Adrian rises and instructs them to withdraw, asserting that it was his appeal. Even, therefore, he hadn't requested him to knock him unconscious, and at that precise instant, the lad faints. A brief time later, he had already awakened, pondering that his uncle's power is indeed on an entirely different plane, incomparable to mere single-core refuse. Thankfully, he appears to be uninjured. Furthermore, ultimately, all turned out well as he triumphed in the contest. At that precise instant, his uncle arrives inquiring what he had accomplished. Additionally, he seeks to understand the nature of that tainted blade, as he never imparted any knowledge regarding such a weapon. Moreover, the main character assertively states that he was merely adhering to the fundamental nature of the blade. Listening. At that moment, Valahard becomes quiet. He then inquires whether the fundamental nature of the blade he envisions embodies that murderous intent. Truly is disconcerting, yet nonetheless, it remains one of the realities. Our son is astonished in the moment, stating that he believed he was about to instruct him, asserting that the journey of the sword is a form of self-improvement. Yet, my companion, the individual, claims he is not a knight but a warrior, and one who treads the road of triumph rather than the virtuous way. Nonetheless, his blade is extravagant, and if his murderous intent is disproportionate, he will fail to differentiate between ally and adversary. In any situation, he will merely observe to determine if he will be consumed by his internal struggles. Following that chaos, 3 days elapse, and Adrian was still practicing with that individual, inquiring whether his name is Taylor, noting that he performed exceptionally well throughout this time. Following, indeed, fending off a blade that cannot restrain its murderous intent for 3 consecutive days is remarkably commendable. Subsequently, the impudent child summons the domestic servant, who subsequently carries a trunk, stating that he learned she committed an inexcusable act in the past, and he is uncertain whether this revelation will alleviate his feelings. However, regardless, she ought to convey this to her father. As the training draws to a close, Idrian expresses that he can depart believing he bears no responsibility for tidying up the chaos that scoundrel created. However, if he compelled someone to labor, it is only just to bear the consequences. Thus, as time progresses, the prince's confrontations transformed into a subject of discussion across the realm. To be frank, I cannot determine if his standing is enhancing or not. Moreover, following several days of anticipation, the information that the public had been eagerly awaiting certainly did not arrive. The knight's perception of him was beginning to shift, and the monarchy was likely silencing them. Nevertheless, the main character appeared rather displeased by that, stating they were merely humiliated by their defeat to him and fell silent. These aristocrats truly lack more worthwhile pursuits and ought to engage in something constructive with their time. Upon hearing this, Valorhard asserts that he has no authority to make such a statement. In response, the lad gazes at the warrior positioned next to him, remarking that upon his departure, he must also disseminate the outcome of the confrontation. In that manner, the speculation should certainly subside. Just then, the servant arrives, claiming there are whispers suggesting he manipulated the sword's influence to fabricate the outcome of today's contest, and listening to Idrian merely becomes increasingly annoyed, stating he will simply disregard it and continue his training. Correct? Indeed, he does. Several series of attacks and his mana core appeared to be intensifying. Following that, he inquires about the number of adversaries remaining, and the knight replies that there is just one more for today. Idrian states that the novice knights no longer have a significant impact. However, the individual claims that the final one is a knight who genuinely mastered the blade. He wasn't content with simply refining the family blade. He is also a skilled individual who became part of a knightly order to hone his swordsmanship. His designation is Arwen Kurgan. Upon entering the fortress, every soldier begins to gaze at her. She possesses an array of monikers, ranging from Cliff Blossom to Thorny Bloom, and she is reputed to have shattered the hearts of numerous men. She is undeniably an extraordinary woman, and to persuade even an individual like her to arrive there willingly, the royal must possess remarkable talent. In any instance, it would be quite fascinating if, ultimately, the prince were defeated by her. What's this? Are you supporting the opposing side? The Order of Knights, known as the Iron Lion, is an organization that strives for prominence in the realm regarding renown and expertise. Essentially, it's a commitment that the individual would have an assured position as a formal member. Following that, Idrian inquires why a prodigy of that caliber would desire to engage in combat with him. He learns that there was a minor miscommunication with her previously, and the protagonist swiftly comprehends that he had already committed an error. Gazing at one of the attendants, he inquires about precisely what he had done. She claims that he somewhat belittled her, and immediately the rascal becomes irate with his own physique. Subsequently, a recollection emerges with Idrian grasping the girl by the shoulder, stating that, as the gossip suggests, she is quite intriguing, inquiring if she wished to be his private attendant. At that instant, she brushes the corpulent man's hand off her shoulder, stating that the Order of Knights does not belong to him. Consequently, my companion, naturally, the overweight individual, was poised to have a tantrum, labeling her unattractive, and returning to the current moment, having absorbed all the information, Idrian becomes quiet, believing that it is impossible for anyone to observe that and deem it unattractive. Subsequently, the young woman salutes the main character, remarking that it has been quite a while, yet he remains exactly the same. The young woman appeared rather discontented, and Idrian believes it is entirely his responsibility. Immediately thereafter, Valahard materializes, gazing at the young woman. She then salutes Valahard, declaring that she is a squire of the Order of the Iron Lion Knights. Subsequently, the gentleman cautions them to handle the prince's blade with care, as it is rather venomous. Observe that yet another one undermining his own faction. With all matters resolved, the confrontation is on the verge of commencing. Without delaying, the young woman unsheathes her blade, and Idrian believes that he is on the verge of witnessing the talent of the renowned emerging talent of the Iron Lion. At that precise instant, the girl sprints directly towards him. He believes that her actions are truly remarkable. He successfully prevents the strike, yet simultaneously, his mana was poised to surge. Conversely, the young woman observes Idrian's initial actions to release a series of blows. Our lad believes he is entirely inundated, and at this pace, he cannot continue. She demands once more, and at that precise moment, Idrian unleashes that dragon hunting ability. Arwen observes it instantly, and on this occasion, Idrian successfully counters the assault. In response, she ultimately withdraws, pondering what type of blade that was. Idrian indicates that possessing a current does not imply uniformity among among them, and undeniably, she operates on a distinct plane compared to the other average individuals. He employs the mechanism to evaluate the young woman, pondering if he can perceive that with his restricted authority, it signifies she is a rival comparable to or inferior to him. In any circumstance, it is now genuine, and simultaneously, the two rush towards one another. Consequently, time advances and all individuals was fatigued. Valorhard subsequently unsheathes his blade, declaring that is sufficient for today and the confrontation will resume tomorrow. Idrian claims he was on the verge of completing this, and the young woman remarks that it is a serendipity, as she was on the verge of doing the identical thing. The pair continue quarreling with one another, and Valorhard instructs them to cease this chaos, since it is already quite late and their wounds require prompt attention. At that precise instant, the physicians arrive, conjuring restorative enchantments, and Idrian continued observing the young woman, and unexpectedly, she was engaged in the identical activity. The duo eventually departs, and Idrian believes that he certainly will not be defeated. A significant period elapses following that chaos, and several soldiers claim that the confrontation seemingly has no conclusion. Today marks the third day, and to be frank, they are rather astonished, since they were already aware of Arwen's prowess, yet your Royal Highness also possesses remarkable talent. In any circumstance, it would be advantageous if the contest were resolved today, wouldn't it? Shortly thereafter, Idrian declares that prior to engaging in battle, he has a message to convey. Arwen inquires if he is on the verge of expressing his desire to offer an apology at this moment. Since that is the situation, she certainly will not agree. Nonetheless, the lad asserts that this is not the case, for, given their fierce struggle, there ought to be a reward at the very least. If that is the situation, the defeated party ought to fulfill one desire of the victor. Upon hearing that, the young woman becomes quiet. The troops are astonished by this, asserting that as a member of the monarchy, such behavior is intolerable. However, the impudent child was utterly indifferent, inquiring about her opinion, and she states that despite being a novice, she is also a part of an assembly of knights devoted to the monarchy, Leonberger. She would not presume to show such disrespect to your majesty, but if it falls within the parameters of his permission, she will embrace this wager. Upon hearing that, Idrian, without delay, unsheathes his blade, stating, "To avoid later grievances, young man, I can already foresee that this is unlikely to conclude positively." The pair persists in the battle, and, as usual, they were well balanced. Our lad appeared extremely enthusiastic about the battle, and subsequently, he employs that absurdly enhanced sword technique once more. The young woman is astonished, reflecting that until yesterday, this sword technique was not as swift as she presumed, that he was likely concealing the complete breadth of his talent. The impudent child maintains the pattern of blows, and Arwen stayed in a protective stance. She advances, rear appearing, weary, and Idrian continues to insist on her. The nuisance simply refuses to relent with the girl. He renders yet another blow, and finally, an individual's blade soars into the sky. The individual who had been vanquished was the knight, and the troops, realizing the situation, are astonished. Furthermore, Valahard found it difficult to fathom, and Idrian, brimming with assurance, asserts that he triumphed in the wager, and elevating his blade, he expresses that he desires her, and that intensified from 0 to 100 at an astonishing pace. The stance, serving as the escort to the notorious rogue, the first prince of the realm, contrary to her expectations, proved to be less challenging than she had anticipated. Even though he appeared rather conceited, he did not behave with ill intent, contrary to what the gossip suggested. And to be truthful, in reality, he was entirely the contrary. The individual continued to observe our protagonist's practice in the downpour, informing the lad that in such circumstances, it was exceedingly perilous. And at that precise instant, a bolt of lightning strikes directly ahead of him. Yet Idrian appeared oblivious to it. Moreover, it was at that moment she experienced a foreboding that his majesty would evolve into an exceptional individual. The setting shifts back to the current moment, accompanied by the troops were taken aback by the request made by our lad. The knight also found it hard to fathom, questioning whether she had misinterpreted that individual. Upon hearing this, Arwen inquires whether that is indeed what your majesty genuinely wishes. He responds that she is merely a typical knight trainee who was unable to vanquish a rogue prince, and that is the reason he desires the promise and prospects of the knight known as Arwen Kurjan. Initially, above all, he requires a champion who would accompany him, and not an individual who would safeguard him by decree of the crown. However, rather someone who was solely essentially his personal champion. Regardless, she possesses significant skill with the blade, once more imploring the maiden to become his champion. Upon hearing that, she stays quiet, believing that she had transformed into the individual she had always envisioned. Yet nobody regarded regarded her as a champion, thus she exerted herself twice as much as all the others. Moreover, despite vanquishing all the trainees and demonstrating diverse outcomes, she still hadn't achieved the status of a genuine knight. Nevertheless, now, matters have changed due to someone contemplated her possibilities as a forthcoming knight, pondering if he was truly being earnest. In response, Arwen requests him to vow a single assurance that he ought to consistently regard her as a knight rather than as a female. If she will comply with any desires your majesty expresses. Two of them remain positioned, gazing at one another, and thus Idrian assures that he will comply. Subsequently, the young woman lowers herself to her knees, declaring that she will pledge allegiance to Prince Idrian Leonberger, committing her blade and the remainder of her existence to your grace. Valahard merely observes all in quietude, and Idrian, elevating his blade, proclaims that in the name of Idrian Leonberger, he inducts her as his knight. With that, time flows and that young lady persisted in her training. Now, one might assume that she had pledged allegiance to that foolish prince, presuming they even maintained some form of connection. In the meantime, Idrian was eavesdropping from a distance, inquiring whether, perhaps, the embodiment of malevolence was his former self. Indeed, it was fundamentally that. The knight alongside him observed everything in quietude, and, shortly thereafter, he contacted the main character, conversing what he had mentioned on that occasion. Particular several days prior, on the final day of the confrontation. Idrian inquires if he was distressed, yet regardless, it's a fact, as if a directive were issued for him to relocate, he would undoubtedly comply. Nevertheless, if he wished, he could also take an oath at a later time, and the individual appeared to have viewed that earnestly, inquiring if he were to make that pledge, would he embrace it? However, the young lad promptly declines, as it would lack excitement to nurture him. The Chevalier merely chuckles, claiming he comprehends, while Idrian believes he is earnest. Shortly thereafter, our young lad received a correspondence announcing that his suspension was over, and he would now partake in the forthcoming royal family feast. The young man claims he was set free a month and a half ahead of schedule. Considering that the previous occasion the monarch had visited, he appeared as if he had no desire to encounter him again. To be truthful, he fails to comprehend the thoughts of that individual, and the knight inquired whether he isn't pleased about the conclusion of the hiatus. However, to Idrian, it matters not, for even if he departs from the palace, he has no destination, and as he is unfamiliar with anyone, he has no one to encounter. Not long after, the other companion emerges, stating that an additional invitation has come for your majesty. Idrian accepts the missive, and while perusing its contents, inquires about this purported social club exclusively for distinguished young gentlemen. What an odd name. The maid replies that it was a society he had been a part of, and the protagonist wonders if it's an unusual establishment, and merely by observing the girl's expression, one can already ascertain that it is. Correct? That location is solely characterized by celebrations and alcohol consumption, and Idrian, aware of the situation, suggests to simply disregard it, as he is already occupied with his training. Correct? Nevertheless, upon perusing the letter once more, he comes to the realization. It originated from a companion named Bernardo belonging to the Eli household. Simultaneously, Idrian recalls that, based on his uncle's words, the lineage that grasped the manna heart until the final moment had perished nearly a century prior, and, incredibly, it was precisely that particular one. And if that is the situation, then he will need to attend the gathering. Correct? And he wishes that the familial circumstances were not as dire. With that, on the day that signified 4 months since he had assumed the form of the rogue prince, he had embarked on rigorous training and was consistently shedding pounds. And fellow, I will be truthful, the individual appeared to be an entirely transformed individual now. He was truly attractive. Our lad claims he has shed a considerable amount of pounds, and the individual next to him responds that his dimensions have diminished by over 50%. Idrian claims he will also entrust him with the court banquet attire, noting that by that time his dimensions will alter once more. Duration passes again, and the young lad was en route to that alleged social club exclusively for social elites. I never cease to express my disdain for that name. In the interim, our lad was perched in the carriage contemplating that the role of a prince is an exceedingly draining circumstance. Grins, coaches, and even attendants, everything about it feels profoundly stifling, and when he glances to the side, he begins gazing at the servant present, inquiring what that injury on her shoulder was. Furthermore, she claims it was a result of her ineptitude and something your highness should undoubtedly lament. Immediately, Idrian is already aware of the events that transpired, believing that this physique is a treasure trove of unfortunate tales. Furthermore, he has encountered this attendant numerous times before, yet he is unaware of her name, inquiring what her name happens to be. Additionally, she claims her name is Adelia Byron, and it's essentially a household that scarcely appears on the roster of aristocrats. Overhearing, Idrian Adrian believes that in ancient times, before the existence of kingdoms and even cities, it was a period when it was commonplace for vulnerable individuals to be plundered and slain. There were individuals who brought a conclusion to the saga of that wretched race of beings known as humans, emerge as the prevailing species of the landmass. Altogether, as his blade, with that, the monarch of the Titans was vanquished, concluding an extensive legacy of oppression. Furthermore, among those who accomplished that remarkable achievement was a figure known as the Lady of the Iron Sword, whose name was Agnes Byron. The most amusing aspect, as during that time, that girl swore incessantly while engaging in battle, as well as merely contemplating it already made him feel uncomfortable. In any case, that individual yonder is likely a progeny of that individual pondering. What on earth transpired for circumstances to conclude in this manner? Immediately after that, a knight proclaims they have at last reached their goal, and the child, not hesitating for a moment, immediately exits the vehicle, declaring he intended to converse with Adelia subsequently. The young woman fails to grasp anything, and immediately thereafter, an individual addresses the main character, stating that Bernardo of the Eli lineage greets him in that location. Frankly, he is completely unaware of how delighted he is to encounter him. Upon hearing that, Adrian contemplates whether this is the reputed heir of the L lineage. Subsequently, the young man remarks that he must have endured significant hardship to shed so much weight, and indeed, subsequent to that, our young lad, for reasons unknown, simply offers a grin. Bernardo inquires if anything was troubling him, and Adrian replies that he is pleased he arrived, and that it is certainly going to be an exceedingly enjoyable day. The fellow still failed to grasp anything at all, and then the setting transitions to that cursed location. Truly, it didn't appear to be a venue suited for a younger crowd, did it? Furthermore, the pair were seated on the couch. Bernardo finds it peculiar, as typically this individual would have already begun to pursue everyone. It seems as though the ambience has shifted in comparison to earlier. Immediately following that, an aristocrat next to them rises, declaring that I've come to understand that your majesty has captivated the blossom of the Iron Lion Fortress, and the whispers are omnipresent. Adrian merely gazes back at him, and the gentleman remarks that the young woman is extraordinarily lovely in her armor, and would likely appear quite attractive even without it. In response, the main character inquires if there is a sibling at home. The aristocrat claims he possesses only a sibling who is female, and in that precise moment, humanity, the central character, strikes him directly in the jaw. All present is astonished by the events that transpired, and Adrian states that's excellent, as if that is indeed true, his family's heritage will not be severed. The main character strikes him precisely at that spot, and goodness, even I sense that impact, and the child declares that henceforth, his sibling will be the successor of the household. He continues, engaging in striking the individual, and astonishingly, nobody takes action, and they merely observe. The esteemed inquires about his motivations, and Adrian instructs him to pay close attention to his words. He doesn't mind if others perceive him as a scoundrel, but he cannot tolerate being regarded as such. That instant, the individuals are even more astonished, yet the main character is completely indifferent and continues to strike the individual. The individual receives, cast far off, and he appeared to be struggling considerably. Adrian then shouts to Bernardo, reiterating his earlier statement that today would be an exceptionally enjoyable day. The individual did not comprehend anything, questioning why this madman was abruptly behaving in such a manner, who instructs them to contact the court during the evenings. Absent. Without delay, the individual proceeds to fulfill Adrian's request, and then that uncomfortable stillness envelopes the whole venue. The host also requests for all the women, notifying them that they are permitted to depart now. Well, my companion, naturally, one of the aristocrats, wasn't going to appreciate that, and just as he was on the verge of taking action, Adrian remarks, he merely instructed the women to depart. Frankly, if he chooses to depart, he is free to do so. However, should he make that decision, he will be exiting as a woman. In light of that, naturally, everyone would fall silent, wouldn't they? And Adrian claims they didn't even officially bow before a monarch, let alone demonstrate any reverence. Furthermore, at that, they mocked him to his face, and to add to the situation, they derided his knight. Regardless, he sought to understand what offense he could accuse them of. Understood. Subsequently, the knights emerge, proclaiming that disrespecting nobility constitutes an offense against the monarchy itself. Furthermore, as if that wasn't sufficient, they also challenged regal power, and that is even regarded as betrayal, inquiring His Majesty to issue the command and whom they ought to remove, and the child with a grin proclaims it will ensure the presence of all individuals. Thus a few time elapses, and Adrian found himself in the monarch's chamber, who remarked that his reprieve had scarcely concluded, yet he was already generating a significant commotion. In total, 14 officers offspring of aristocrats were apprehended, and Adrian employed every rationale available, inquiring whether he understands what he has truly accomplished. Adrian then inquires whether he is concerned about the response. Nevertheless, their individuals, their kin had already forsaken, for retaining them would merely tarnish their reputations further. These are hopeless cases, thus he ought to dispatch correspondence to the families. Upon that, the elderly gentleman becomes quiet, and astonishingly indicates that Adrian might depart. Thus, moment passes, and Adrian assures her that she need not feel anxious, as he has no intention of causing her harm. The unfortunate creature was quaking with trepidation, inquiring whether she had committed an error, and Adrian believes that wretched prince must have committed atrocious acts against this servant. Not even the family's immediate lineage was acquainted with Byron, which signifies that the narrative of glory was wiped clean and the unmatched artistry was severed. To be frank, the immense reputation and elevated arrogance vanished without a remnant. However, incredibly, that young lady possesses some intriguing statistics. One of them is the war craze characteristic, and the remaining statistics are likewise identical to what that girl from the past possessed. Adrian believes that regrettably she has no means of managing that chaos, pondering if he could release her into this realm. Regardless, he ought to make an effort. After all, she possesses S-tier aptitude. Moreover, by a fortunate turn of events, she possesses a quality he could utilize. To be more precise, it embodies the essence of a servant, a quality marked by experiencing immense pleasure in the presence of a master whom one dutifully attends to. Without delay, our young man urged the girl to pledge her allegiance to him. She was attempting to comprehend what was occurring, and Adrian claims he was requesting her to become his champion. Thus, she must pledge right at this very moment. Nevertheless, at that precise instant, the attendant lowers herself to her knees, expressing that this is beyond what she can endure, and Adrian states that she mentioned her family is unremarkable. Therefore, if that is true, he will assume personal accountability for her. However, in exchange, she will be required to pledge allegiance to him and serve him as her sovereign, believing that if she is unable to manage her turmoil independently, he will assist her. The attendant inquires whether he will genuinely assume accountability for her family, as well as Adrian states that if she desires, he could transport them to the capital so she could visit them whenever she pleased. Indeed, departed, the distressed maiden is elated, and without delay, promptly pledges her allegiance, stating that she will attend to him and dedicate her existence to him. The main character performs likewise, stating that from that moment forward, she is required to follow his commands without question. Therefore, all matters were resolved, and Adrian continued to harbor uncertainties, contemplating whether he had made the correct choice. Yet only time will reveal, my friend. As a result, whispers circulated that the eldest prince had reverted to his nefarious ways, as he coerced a knight's pledge of allegiance through unscrupulous tactics, and even convened the offspring of the aristocrat to assault them and imprison them. Furthermore, from this, he is currently designating a servant who has never wielded a blade as his knight, and it is evident that he is attempting to establish a harem under the pretense of direct knights. Nevertheless, the impudent child was entirely unperturbed, questioning when everyone had become so captivated by him. The sole action he took was to receive a direct challenge from the knight, and despite that, everyone has been criticizing him since the break of dawn. The speculations are proliferating at an alarming rate, and shortly thereafter, the attendant appears announcing that the sovereign has arrived. At that moment, she claims she believed he had transformed his existence, yet it appears he aims to revert to his former behaviors. Regardless, this might be intriguing, as once a union was orchestrated and he established himself, her monotonous existence would reach its conclusion, inquiring to have faith in his mother, as she would undoubtedly secure him a companion this time. The lady departs brimming with assurance, and Adrian believes he is entirely unaware of the circumstances. Yet a short while later, Adelia encountered the main character, inquiring if she too would wield mana. Adrian replies, that is precisely accurate, as she will cultivate a distinct form of mana contemplation. That society had entirely overlooked the Sword Empress. Nevertheless, indeed, he had overlooked nothing, from the imprints she had made to the manner in which her blade oscillated in her grasp. That at that instant, a halo surrounds the girl's figure, and the system alerts that it has identified mana within her. Successfully, the mana flows into the young woman's physique, and the system indicates that a mana core has at last been formed. Adrian remarks, what he just accomplished is a honing technique for the mana heart, and from this moment forward, whenever she has the opportunity, she must undertake it independently. That at that precise instant, our lad begins to waver, considering that it is pitiable to conclude in this manner, merely from forging one insignificant mana heart. Adelia inquires if he is well, curious about why he would go to such lengths for someone as modest as her, and Adrian indicates that all is well, she is free to depart now. Transforming charming. The individual in question inquires why she is gazing at him in such a manner, and correctly so. Subsequently, the young woman proclaims her intention to devote herself to him with unwavering fidelity for the entirety of her existence. The impudent child offers a grin, urging her to merely recall that he is her superior, and with that he departs contemplating that truthfully he fears she could overlook. After several days have elapsed, the knight proclaims that it has come to my attention that Bernardo is currently detained by the royal palace security as a witness to the recent occurrence. Supposedly, nobody is permitted to confer with him until the hearing takes place, and Adrian inquires if he is also required to attend that trial, to which the individual responds that members of the royal lineage do not testify in court. In the meantime, the housekeeper continued her tasks, and Adrian inquired about her well-being recently. To be more precise, he inquired if the manhua heart had already achieved stability, and the girl replied affirmatively, and if so, commencing today, she will accompany him when he goes to practice, instructing her to modify her attire and proceed directly to the practice area. It is indeed the moment to cast aside those garments, wouldn't you agree, companion? A short while later, our young lad had arrived at the practice field, and Valahard inquires about what he believes he is currently engaged in. The main character claims he is merely getting started, yet the man claims he is talking about that young woman. Our protagonist replies, it is precisely as he had listened to in the gossip, for he is essentially endeavoring to transform her into a knight, and he is enraged. The uncle wishes to ascertain if knights appeared to be that inconsequential to him. Immediately afterward, Adelia emerges, stating that she had completed the 10 circuits. Valahard still appeared troubled, and Adrian, without delay, instructs the girl to grab that blade, for today he is going to instruct her in some fundamental positions. He promptly begins by demonstrating the actions, encouraging the girl to replicate them. She then seizes the blade and befriend her expression alters instantly. Valahard is astonished by what he is witnessing, and Adrian, I can hardly fathom that she truly replicated everything after observing it just a single time. The girl entirely instinctively inquires if her position was accurate, and Adrian believes that if he relaxes his vigilance, he will undoubtedly be outdone effortlessly. The characteristic she possesses is deference to the powerful and a lack of regard for the feeble, and he is already cautious because that rogue threatened her previously, and if he allows her to exceed him, who can predict the outcome? Indeed, my companion. In the meantime, Valiant had altered his viewpoint, expressing that he was unaware of the extent of her abilities. Nonetheless, the main character promptly instructs him to cease that inquiry, to avoid any misconceptions. Valahard inquires what an individual of his ilk might offer for this young one, since he is merely a beginner who has scarcely wielded a blade for a handful of months. He struggles to cope with her capabilities. In that moment, our protagonist becomes quiet, believing he possesses an aura powerful enough to instill dread in that scoundrel, compelling him to flee. Yet naturally, he is not the individual inhabiting this form at present, indeed asserting that if he is unable to manage her, no one else will. Following entirely, he is an individual who utterly obliterated innumerable beings. The sorcery, a blade known as Gruen. Instantly, the system materializes, proclaiming that a portion of the soul was expressing itself within the physique through the user's intent. Subsequently, my companion, that utterly flawed dragon-slaying talent resurfaces yet again, and Valahard simply observes without shifting a single muscle. Hey, my companion, this is beginning to resemble a territorial conflict, and Adrian, with utmost nonchalance, claims that the girl belongs to him. Frankly, he detests it when someone appropriates what belongs to him. Simultaneously, his uncle stays quiet, and at that precise instant, our young lad departs, descends into a state of reverie as he comprehends that his grasp on reality is fading away. Subsequently, he somewhat comprehends what was occurring, presuming that if this continues, this frail physique will be devoured by the essence of the infernal blade, Gruen. Consequently, a portal swings wide and a flurry of hands reaches out toward the main character. He remains completely still. Furthermore, the scene shifts back to the current moment with an uncle asserting that a typical evening can preserve the existence of 10 warriors. However, an extraordinary knight has the potential to preserve the lives of over 100 warriors, and that youngster over there could potentially have the ability to rescue 1,000 warriors or even beyond. He proceeds, the clarification provided there. However, the young woman declares that her body and spirit are already pledged to his majesty, and she cannot heed his commands. At that moment, the man becomes quiet, and Adrian believes it was worthwhile to bring even her essence along, as a submissive disposition is fated to yield to a superior status. Shifting the topic, he inquires of Valahard whether he has no other engagements, for from the outset his sole objective has been to shed pounds. However, if he he wishes to continue frequenting him at the palace, he ought not to meddle in his matters. Astonishingly, the man acquiesces to everything, and even after, on that particular day, his uncle continuously frequented the palace solely to monitor Adelia. He felt powerless as voicing grievances and meddling were prohibited. Adrian finds it rather entertaining to witness the haughty uncle behaving in such a manner. Subsequently, in that precise instant, a shimmering glow starts to envelop the young woman's blade. Both of them are astonished by what they were observing, and Adrian ponders whether she had already perfected that so-called blade resonance. Ecstatic, he expresses that she had performed remarkably well in her contemplation, that if she continues to advance at this pace, he could ultimately be outstripped. And indeed, subsequently, his enraged uncle inquires whether he truly instructed her in the manhua. Is it sufficient for him to independently master such a trivial skill? And upon hearing that, our young lad simply shoots him a piercing look indicating him to depart. However, his uncle was already disheartened, expressing that there had been a far superior route and opportunities that surpassed his wildest dreams. However, he completely squandered it all. Subsequently, our lad was already exasperated and instructed the knight to remove his uncle. However, he insists that he will depart independently, with all possessions in tow. Once established, Adelia inquires whether what she acquired is a minor skill, and certainly, Adrian promptly counters that this is not accurate, noting that the individuals of this epoch have entirely overlooked the essence of a genuine manhua. Had they not overlooked, they would never have cast it aside like refuse. Yet as time passed, she will unveil the genuine potential of this skill. Subsequently, a day transfers, and Adrian, astonished, he states, believed he had declared he would never return. Yet the individual asserts that to demonstrate it, he will employ merely one link, and if he can apply even slight pressure, he will recognize him. Lacking. Without delay, our protagonist seizes the blade, inquiring what the bet entailed in those times, which essentially involved granting a desire to the individual who triumphed. Valahard asserts that should he defeat him, he will bestow upon him any desire. Furthermore, if he requests the transfer of even the ancestral skill, he will comply. Nonetheless, Adrian states that this isn't his desire, yet for the moment that suffices. And at that precise instant, he lunges at the elderly man who effortlessly evades. Valahard, brimming with assurance, asserts that he has been targeting the neck from the beginning, declaring that it remains an exceptionally ruthless blade. Our lad executes the identical action, and he appeared quite concentrated, didn't he? He persists. The series of assaults, and Valahard, with a mere stroke of his blades, obstructs Adrian's hit, inquiring if that is all he possesses. The youth stays quiet, and immediately following that, he withdraws. Valahard inquires if he has already relinquished, and Adrian, refusing to comply, perceives him as bothersome, yet he must acknowledge that his uncle possesses remarkable strength. He is anticipating his unleashing of mana solely to ensure he endures an even more wretched defeat, culminating that with this degree of mana essence, he will undoubtedly be defeated by him. Shortly thereafter, the child shifts the topic and inquires whether it isn't peculiar, noting, for centuries ago, numerous warriors with mana hearts achieved astonishing accomplishments. However, merely due to the emergence of a practical method, the skills of those esteemed knights were regarded as worthless. It appears that everyone is convinced that the mana chain technique offers a far superior means of controlling mana compared to the mana heart, and upon hearing, Valahard inquires about the direction he is taking with this, and he replies that his reflections are notably distinct. In conclusion, it was not the mana heart that was frail, but its wielder, and not every mana heart is identical, inquiring his uncle if he has ever come across a knightly verse, and the irate individual exclaims, "This is a battleground, not a spot to linger while belting out some foolish tune." And Adrian states he was already aware he would express that, as he even referred to the mana heart as a basic skill that merely mercenaries acquire. Then Adrian calls upon his mana, articulating that alleged chant. The journey of the knight transforms into an accomplishment, and devoid of triumphs, there is neither honor nor strength. The accomplishments inscribed in the soul, and the inscribed accomplishments transform into a knightly verse, and everything resides within the knight's blade. Abruptly, the system proclaims that the noble verse has been fashioned, and the child perceives that he has attained at least one minor achievement he has cultivated over the past half-year. Moreover, that at that moment lies the genuine strength of the mana core. The child was radiating everywhere, and Valahard asserts that regardless of his actions, the outcome will remain identical. As long as he holds a mana core, he will never triumph over the mana flow. And Adrian, disregarding all else, rushes towards his uncle, who declares that elven mana possesses the characteristic of redirecting the current of mana within the heart. The young lad was experiencing a certain level of challenge, while his uncle was entirely relaxed in stating that he excels at tenaciously persevering like a fool, yet our lad offers a grin while contemplating that to acquire this poem he battled over 100 times, persevering. The elf's magical energy exertion exceeds 1,000-fold. This is a force crafted expressly to confront a champion of the waves, and at that precise instant an eruption occurs, and therein lies the genuine strength of the double verse. Now, they could ultimately contend authentically and without delaying any further, the two engage in combat and Idrian advances. On the attack, he was significantly more assured, now contemplating how extended his uncle's capacity to endure. At that instant, he ultimately envelopes his blade with energy, launching a counter-offensive. Our lad, he seizes a recede and the uncle was attempting to comprehend how that was feasible. Idrian states he had previously cautioned him that not all mana hearts are identical, yet the individual refuses to acknowledge it, claiming that he is exceedingly haughty. Indeed, subsequently he lunges at the child, tossing him up against the wall, stating that leisure period has concluded and the reality that he endured for this duration is already remarkable enough. He certainly receives his acknowledgement, and as Idrian collapses to the earth, he reflects that, as anticipated, an ordinary tier chivalric verse would prove insufficient. He then regains his composure, stating that 4 centuries prior, the warriors committed a grave error. They departed no adversaries for their heirs, and initially everything must have been transmitted unaltered. The swordsmanship and the approach to purifying the spirit. There were also the magnificent knightly verses, yet the passage of time diminished those dazzling accomplishments until they ultimately just slipped into obscurity. Melodies concerning dragons unseen and colossal monarchs unknown to anyone. Ultimately, they must have transformed into mere hollow legends. Naturally, novel chivalric verses might have been composed, yet they could never attain the level of those of the champions and beyond. Currently, the main character asserts that a method akin to mana flow will never attain enlightenment. In response, the individual expresses that for some time he has been unable to comprehend anything he has been articulating, and Idrian reflects that Valahard is a foolish and haughty warrior, referencing that it is already the moment for them to comprehend precisely how much they have forfeited. Ultimately, if he remains unaware, he'll ensure to demonstrate the genuine might of a mana heart wielder. He articulates yet another of those hallowed incantations, and the system cautions that his present ability does not accommodate the caliber of this verse. Ultimately, he succeeded in conveying merely a fraction of the poem's lines, which pertain to severing the dragon's armor, but my companion. That was quite sufficient for the child to lunge at his uncle, who astonishingly successfully deflects the assault, and now he was experiencing a certain challenge in cognitive processing, that if this continues, he will ultimately be devoured. At that precise instant, an detonation occurs, and the main character is cast far off. Amidst the haze, his uncle remained upright while the boy merely observes, inquiring whether he did not mention that he would utilize solely a single ring, contemplating that even after he utilized all 4 rings at his disposal, he nevertheless failed to prevent his blade from being severed. Our young lad then rises again, and Valahard believes it ought to be an undeniable fact that heart mana is lesser than contemporary mana. Yet now that was not the situation. My companion and Idrian states that Valahard had been vanquished. At that moment passes, and our lad appeared to be enduring a condition. The child continued shifting and turning in the bed, murmuring that all of this is attributed to the chivalric verse. This is the cost of pushing the strength of the knightly verse past its boundaries. Ultimately, the poem of the Dragon Slayer is of legendary caliber. Gratitude to that his heart is shattered, yet his selflessness was valuable. It was the initial knightly verse he crafted independently, and he will remain steadfast in the face of even more formidable surges. That the instant Adelia arrives at the location, she is delighted that the child ultimately stirred awake, exclaiming that there was a considerable uproar following his fainting spell, and she had never witnessed his mother so anxious. In addition to that, Valahard requested her to inform him once the main character regained consciousness, but the individual instructs not to inform him just yet, as he wishes to recuperate for a while. He was truly experiencing the repercussions of employing the poem's contemplation, that should he fail to restore the essence that was harmed by the compelled employment of the knightly verse, he would incur a dire consequence. The recollections of yesteryears and the present will intertwine in a disordered knot until eventually the line separating reality disintegrates entirely. Hence, the individual ultimately descends into madness, perpetually re-experiencing instances of triumph in a warped reality, and to believe that he ultimately transformed into a human, only to be confined once more by the recollections of a blade. With that, as time elapses, Idrian remarks that Agnes Byron was an exceptional fencer, daughter, and given that she is a straightforward heir and might receive a knightly verse that he bequeathed. The young lady is astonished to have such an extraordinary forebear, and Idrian remarks that to attain a status deserving of that verse, she must progress significantly further. That being stated, that he inquires about her plans once she has perfected the craft of swordsmanship. Upon hearing that, the young woman becomes quiet, and indeed she doesn't appear to possess the faintest notion of what she desired. Idrian states that if she is unable to recall it at this moment, she can inform him at a later time, and then the young woman declares that she will persist in being his blade. At that instant, Idrian is astonished, contemplating that certain verses commence with the resonance of a trumpet, whereas others initiate with the initial stride into conflict, yet there exist heroic verses whose narratives commence with a heartfelt pledge. At the instant the system proclaims that Adelia was presenting a poem of surrender, our young man ponders whether that was her gallant verse. In addition to that, occasionally, a verse such as this has the potential to impact others, and the framework proclaims that a fresh knightly verse has been composed. Observe the magnitude of that tree, my companion. That particular one is shared category, and Idrian expresses that the poem of surrender is an ode devoted to a sovereign and a pledge of allegiance that unites spirits despite its subservient traits. Frankly, there was no means to anticipate that an heir of the Sword Queen would be presented with a poem of subservience such as he did. Some surprising assistance in finalizing that as long as he remains the focus of that poem by Adelia's expansion will likewise provide him with certain advantages. Our young man shortly appreciates her, considering that he remains unaware of how those advantages will materialize, and thus a handful. Time elapses, and our young lad departed. Doesn't appear particularly joyful. His pair of evenings merely keep quiet, and his mother inquires about his well-being, and he promptly replies in the affirmative, believing that it is simpler to engage with an individual who despises this physique, yet it is significantly more awkward to be in the presence of someone who admired the previous proprietor. Shortly following, his mother inquires whether he harbors resentment towards his uncle, stating that he did not intend to cause him pain, so even if he harbors some bitterness, he ought to release it. Idrian states he harbors no resentment, yet his mother anxiously remarks that he was exceedingly impolite and voiced objections to every minor aspect, thus asserting that he holds no grudge must surely be a falsehood. However, the boy nonchalantly expresses that he genuinely experiences emptiness when contemplating that he had already retaliated against him that day, and as all his dignity and beliefs were rejected, it must be challenging for him to withstand it all. In summary, what he sowed in his uncle that day was a heart fiend. If he perseveres, he will take an even larger stride, yet truthfully, he remains indifferent to what transpires thereafter. Shortly following, his mother claims that his uncle resided nearer to the blade than others, which is why he must have been quite coarse. Nevertheless, he must hold an exceptionally favorable view of the main character, since he went to great lengths to personally convince His Majesty it was due to him that his imprisonment was released sooner than anticipated. Yet because the unexpected event occurred immediately after his detention concluded, his uncle's situation must have grown quite challenging. Listening to all of that, Idrian believes that this is the reason he had behaved so distastefully earlier. Nevertheless, in any event, he seeks to understand the reason that individual would go to such lengths for him. Shortly thereafter, an elderly gentleman emerges carrying a stack of tomes, and Idrian remarks that he detests this with all his being. At that the instant the lad begins to throw a tantrum, inquiring why he must engage in learning, the elderly gentleman responds that an individual who does not pursue wisdom is akin to a beast. Infuriated, Idrian inquires if he is labeling him as a beast, to which the gentleman replies that Your Majesty has merely embarked on his education and consequently cannot yet be categorized as such, yet he asserts with assurance, indicates that he is fully aware of all the actions he must take and has previously stated that there is no necessity for further learning. Upon hearing this, the elderly gentleman states that if that is indeed the situation, they will proceed with the subsequent request to converse about several subjects, and if Your Majesty's talents are truly as remarkable as asserted, he shall no longer return to trouble him. Therefore, Idrian acknowledges, and shortly thereafter he states, this is the reason you should consistently exercise caution with individuals behind you, as inherently, if you grant people excessive liberty, they ultimately take advantage of you. I find this perplexing. Anything now, yet the elderly gentleman asserts that all is well and, presenting him with a book, claims it will captivate the youth. The pair proceeds that monotonous study period, and thus time elapses. Having concluded their discussion, the elderly gentleman suggests they will resume their dialogue the following day. Remarkably, Idrian appeared to have enjoyed it, and moments later, he comes to a realization. What he was contemplating, believing it culminated in an ordinary lesson, frankly, that the elderly gentleman is remarkably astute, and concurrently, the elderly man was astonished, contemplating that the prince greatly contrasts with the tales circulating, and thus a day elapses, and our lad was reclined on the mattress, expressing that he is extremely uninterested, contemplating whether he has been excessively industrious recently, as he has no engagements since he is not practicing. Correct? At that precise instant, Adelia enters, announcing that Lord Valahard has arrived, and the young lad is delighted to finally receive a guest, requesting her to permit him entry, believing that a couple of days had elapsed since their previous confrontation, so it was only fitting for him to make an appearance. Wouldn't you agree? Yet when he gazes at the individual, it appears as if he were struck by a freight vehicle, and he unquestionably has not recovered from the emotional turmoil that was instilled within him. The individual remains quiet. Immediately following, that astonishingly expresses regret to the main character he possessed, violated the commitment he established with himself, resulting in a significant injury, and even if he expressed remorse endlessly, nothing could excuse his actions. Yet the young one contemplates. The cause of his need for therapy was not his uncle's aura blade, but rather his compulsion to utilize the dragon-slaying verse and subsequently act accordingly. Distantly he recalls what his mother had mentioned, for since he created difficulties, his uncle's predicament must have grown exceedingly intricate in the meantime. The uncle continued to feel dreadful, inquiring about what he might desire if he wished for something. He could remove his arm and even his eye, and clearly the child wouldn't desire such a thing, questioning why he would long for something like that, pondering that previously he would have attained the status of a blade expert, but now he is hindered by a foolish heart demon. Leaving the young one, asserts he will be magnanimous in stating that he will announce his initial desire since he wished for him to permit him to venture out for a short period. Valahard states that now that his house confinement has concluded, he is free to venture out at his leisure, yet Idrian insists he isn't referring to a mere excursion and genuinely desires to travel to a more distant location, particularly outside the metropolis. The individual claims it will allocate some time to organize everything, and given that a feast is approaching, they cannot venture too far, except for Idrian refuses to listen to any of that, claiming it's not an issue with anything. The elderly gentleman states he will reach out once the timetable is established. Then the individual exits the chamber, and Idrian inquires, why is the knight gazing at him in that manner, who claims it's somewhat surprising because he assumed your majesty would require something considerably more unreasonable. After all, the count violated his pledge, and in numerous aspects this presents a unique chance. Nevertheless, Idrian indicates that observing that obstinate individual behave in such a manner evoked a slight sense of pity in him. Upon hearing that, the knight begins chuckling, and Idrian remarks that he has been becoming excessively at ease recently. At that precise moment, Adelia manifests, declaring that the correspondence he had been anticipating had at last reached him, was composed by Arwen, who mentions that she has recently attained a minor achievement and holds the belief she may have the opportunity to see him shortly, wishing that he remains unharmed until that cherished time arrives. The child gazes at the message joyfully, remarking that it arrived at an opportune moment, and approximately 5 days later, his uncle dispatched confirmation, and an additional 2 days elapsed until the day of departure, resulting in a total of a week elapsed, and the main character in a carriage inquired about the region they would be traversing, to which the man responded, maintains his typical sour disposition, asserting he cannot remain silent, and since he intends to clarify it, he might as well remain seated in the carriage. Fundamentally, the destination they're heading to is Count Ellen's domain. It's the principal arms manufacturing facility for the palace, along with an iron quarry to provide premium raw materials and a forge guide to enhance it. It's not an overstatement to assert that over 50% of the royal household's armaments originate from that esteemed lineage, and astonished, Idrian believes that since his rank has significantly increased, it is high time to seek a blade to claim as his own. He could simply acquire a respectable sword from the royal armory. However, regrettably, since existence is challenging, they are unable to provide him with any armament after all. They had not overlooked the actions of the child in the past, my companion reflecting. This individual's history is quite typical. However, that implies that if he seeks a genuine armament, he will need to acquire it beyond the palace, apart from Valahard. It may not appear this way, yet he is unexpectedly thoughtful regardless. That 20. The daytime excursion was on the verge of commencing. The voyage entails a short pause in Count Ellen's domain, located 3 days from the royal capital, followed by a return to Iron Lion Castle, which is situated 2 days away, and subsequently they will return to the regal metropolis following the restoration from the exhaustion of the voyage. At this moment, the main character has remained in that carriage for a complete 3 days without shifting a single limb, and regrettably, the individual positioned before him is devoid of any amusement. The child was genuinely extremely disheartened and pondering whether he ought to examine his mana core while he's present at his core is vacant as a consequence of utilizing the dragon verse, yet it is already. It's time to begin replenishing it once more. His perceptions remains keen due to his could sense all aspects, from the gentle zephyr flowing through to the murmurs, from the horsemen beyond and through assembling. The shards of mana concealed within them could remarkably replenish his mana heart anew. He successfully accomplishes it, yet something is distinct due to the fact that his mana core is significantly larger, and the system cautions that he endeavored an unattainable miracle and perceived a shard of that vast will. Idrian reflects that this outcome stems from the exertion of the dragon poem, and at that precise moment, the system proclaims that he has attained the rank of sword specialist. His bond with the source has slightly enhanced, leading to the removal of certain limitations on his regained powers as a consequence. The power of the third eye was considerably amplified, and Idrian immediately begins examining his physique, acknowledging that he has developed the scene significantly more than the focus transitions, to assess Elend's domain and just observe the magnitude of that estate immediately thereafter. That an individual expresses that they are unable to articulate the privilege of encountering them in such a manner while introducing themselves. He claims his name is Edgar from the Elend lineage, and the individual next to him is referred to as Torrance Idrian. Thank you them for their warm welcome, and the gentleman in the crimson attire remarks that they must be fatigued from their extensive travels, inviting them to allow him to guide them to their accommodation. The youth strolls through the estate pondering that they claimed this was a site that manufactured armaments, and in fact the entire estate is adorned with various types of weaponry. However, they are merely inferior products that appear ostentatious but are ineffective in actual combat. It seems it will be challenging to locate what he seeks there. Shifting the topic, he inquires whether they mentioned that the Blacksmith's Guild resides within the region. If that is true, he would like to examine that location and spend a few moments there. Subsequently, the steward states that blacksmiths are impolite and obstinate by disposition, and when their tasks are in full progress, they frequently disregard even the nobleman, regardless of his presence during a visit. Considers their conduct objectionable. He ought to demonstrate compassion, acknowledging that it embodies the essence of the craftsman observing the craft. The lad is astonished, and the gentleman remarks that the intensity of the furnace is extreme, urging him to inform them if it becomes excessively challenging to endure. The main character persists to observe in quiet contemplation that the fires bellow and the metalworkers continue striking the steel, and amidst all that there exists one especially distinct sound. The lad appears to acknowledge all of this contemplation, that this is likely the conclusion after all. The earliest recollection he can summon is that we overlook he was formerly a blade, correct? Not long thereafter, Adelia states that His Royal Highness was perspiring excessively. Nevertheless, he averts his gaze, proceeding to observe the metalworker shaping shortly thereafter. All the blacksmiths present themselves by extending their salutations to the esteemed prince. The steward states that this individual oversees the Blacksmiths Association, while simultaneously one of the men continued crafting. The irate fellow inquires about his actions, commanding him to cease instantly and acknowledge the prince upon hearing that Idrian merely instructs the man to hush and observe. In the vicinity of those youthful individuals, he believes it. It appears they were compelled to go there against their own desire. Then he remarks, the metal is losing heat, and if they plan to allow the forge flames to extinguish, they might as well remain still in that position without squandering time. Gerald resumes his metallurgical work while Idrian stays behind. Mute, the fellow simply cannot cease observing that infuriating blacksmith and fellow, that individual truly is remarkable. The main character observed something in that infuriating youth, pondering what precisely. That sensation occurred somewhat later when the steward remarked that, for some inexplicable reason, that individual had been persistently engaging in the act of crafting and liquefying swords for half a year. The youth inquired if they might all have ended in defeat, yet the young man appears oblivious to this, as every blade he creates a magnum opus. He is acknowledged as the supreme blacksmith. For him, the blades the metalworker had crafted appeared impeccable, and it remained an enigma why he liquefied each and every one of them. In addition, for the past month, he has scarcely rested and has been thoroughly engrossed in his job. Given that he is no longer youthful, they have expressed significant concern regarding his well-being, and upon hearing this, the sole thought occupying Idrian's mind is that this individual is a genuine craftsman. For several days, time went by, and each dawn, the prince arrived promptly at the blacksmith's workshop, departing only after the sun had set. Throughout this period, the elderly craftsman persisted with his routine tasks, while our young lad restricted himself to a modest role, himself to observing quietly in defiance of the strain prompted by the speculation regarding the arrival of the first prince. There was an event that was rather astonishing to them. However, eventually, the day of the royals' exit arrived nonetheless. The lad continued to observe the metalworker shaping the iron tirelessly. Then the main character remarks that he had wished to witness its completion before departing, but regrettably, that does not appear to be the scenario. Our protagonist seems truly disappointed, deeply remorseful in expressing that. As he is departing, they mention there will be a send-off gathering this evening and consequently, he will need to depart at daybreak, and thus time flows on and the day ultimately dawns. Shortly thereafter, the steward materializes, remarking that it appears the master has completed his sword with great efficiency. The lad approaches the craftsman who was grasping the blade while cleansing it. The weapon's blade is genuinely deserving of the title masterpiece. And then the ancient, a man kneels before the sovereign, declaring that he commits that blade to the youth, and all are astonished. Through that, and Idrian contemplates that it merely requires warming akin to the sun, blazing on the skyline and then chilled until its tint corresponds with the monarch's violet garments. If that is accomplished, a blade gleaming like the sun and reminiscent of royalty would be destined to be ours. I'm struggling to comprehend anything further, Idrian persists, to gaze at the blade, inquiring whether it possesses a title from the smith. States he was contemplating naming it Twilight, wishing to understand. Regardless of whether it would be the twilight of morning or of evening for him, it ought to be twilight, yet to your grandeur it will undoubtedly be dawn. And upon hearing this, Idrian remarks that he articulates quite eloquently for his age, but in the meantime, the man appeared to be unwell and collapsing to the earth. He claims it is a comfort to have completed the blade without squandering time. Our lad assists the metalworker by stating that they will need to remain overnight once more as time goes by, and Idrian was attending to the blacksmith, who states that the instant your highness halted behind him that day, the blade materialized as though it were destiny that selected the sword, his own moment of arrival, and Idrian inquires if that is his perspective while advancing nearer to the individual. He informs him something that regrettably remains unknown. He likely expressed that he was in fact a blade in a previous existence, correct? And upon hearing that, the elderly gentleman claims he might even assume the role of divinity, but regardless, at this moment, he comprehends all things, requesting to permit him glance at that blade briefly, and upon grasping it, he desires that this blade would transform into as splendid as its bearer, and immediately afterwards, the main character grasping the aged gentleman's palm indicates that it unquestionably shall, and subsequently, my companion, the elderly gentleman, mournfully departed, yet at the very least, he departed with dignity after completing his blade, correct? It was only a brief moment ago. Subsequently, the cherished item had already been packaged, and the steward remarks that he is unable to assess the worth of a blade crafted with the weapon itself, yet he surmises it might not be appropriate for your highness's utilization by mere chance. There was an additional enchanted blade he had planned to present to him, urging him to embrace the present. Idrian, reciprocating, is astonished, claiming that it is a formidable weapon, believing that even if it isn't of premium quality, it remains an outstanding mid-tier sword. Nevertheless, he asserts the fact that a blade crafted by a distinguished artisan who infused his very spirit into it is already an extraordinary present. Moreover, he had previously intended to present an enchanted sword, and upon learning this, the attendant swiftly comprehends the predicament he has entangled himself in, yet he had no alternative. Yet to embrace it all, believing he had attempted to retrieve the master's blade by using that alternative as a lure, but regrettably, he ultimately relinquished both, correct? The individual truly botched it, and shortly thereafter. Subsequently, everyone was already preparing to head back to the royal metropolis, while our young lad simply observes. All fell into quietude shortly thereafter. Valahard indicates that he ought to prepare himself, as they intend to travel swiftly today in order to arrive at the Iron Lion Fortress by nightfall. Nevertheless, our young lad nonchalantly states that he is unfamiliar with horseback riding, leaving everyone astonished. However, there's no chance the child would be aware, considering he was previously a blade, correct? With that, time elapses, as well as the main character appeared to possess certain types of challenges, but fortunately, everything turned out well despite it required double the anticipated duration. They arrived at their location in approximately an entire day that existed, the purported Iron Lion Fortress, and immediately following that, a group of soldiers emerges. The individual over there remarks that York of the Willow lineage salutes the esteemed first prince. Observing the circumstances, Idrian appeared to have perceived something, and goodness, the troops evidently appeared rather discontented. Is an explanation for that, correct? And then, the main character, beginning to incite them, calls out to Arwen. The young woman then acknowledges, responding to him by stating that she had been tallying the days, anticipating the instant of reuniting with him, and at that precise moment, my comrade, each individual begins to seethe with animosity, yearning to pursue the main character, and, astonishingly, the identical occurrence takes place with Adelia in that regard. Idrian, observing the situation, rests a hand on the young woman's shoulder she appeared to possess. Resumed its usual state regardless. It was satisfactory. To awaken her servile nature in advance soon after, Idrian calling to Arwen, requesting her to pursue him as there are numerous matters they ought to discuss, believing it would be even more advantageous if those individuals accompanied them as well, albeit a bit later. The main character was gripping a blade, expressing his desire to witness the Iron Lion martial technique, as it is reputed to be the finest in the realm, and if that is indeed true, he was eager to discover who would dare to challenge him as the soldiers begin disputing there, and Idrian merely timepieces, proclaiming that if the role is a liability for them, he assures in the designation of Leon Berger, for which no one shall be accountable for the outcome of the confrontation, inquiring if it remains nobody will come forth, and who could have anticipated that the esteemed Iron Lions would exhibit such timidity upon hearing that. The warrior then consents to the confrontation, and that auburn-haired individual over yonder is named Dale. He is quite distant from deserving to embody the Iron Lion's technique of sword fighting, yet if allowed, he would have the audacity to present himself before your majesty. However, Idrian asserts there is no cause for concern, as he was the one who extended the invitation, and without delay. At that moment the soldier lunges toward him, and the child, utterly serene, absorbs the impact the auburn-haired individual was experiencing. A certain form of challenge, and in that identical. Immediately, with utmost simplicity, he is propelled far from the individual, the essence. The heart is undeniably exceptionally potent, and Idrian, without hesitating, promptly instructs the next individual to step forward, the other fellow. There also attempts to face off against our lad, but regrettably, he encounters the identical destiny as the other combatant, and subsequently time elapses, and the child continues to overpower every warrior that confronts him. He was already beginning to feel uninterested in a brief period. Subsequently, all the troops were spread out on the terrain. Idrian contemplates that he is beginning to lose his composure and desires to confront the authorized members next. The young man calls out. Approaching Arwen, he mentions that upon his return to the capital, she will join him. The girl remains quiet, yet still she embraces the child's command. Shortly thereafter, another warrior emerges, stating that I heard Idrian enjoys placing wagers, and if that's true, he aimed to engage him in a bet to inject some excitement into the situation. But at that moment, my companion, Idrian, comprehends the situation and promptly declines the wager, stating that Arwen is not a reward for the tournament if that is the circumstance. They ought to wager something different in its place and embrace his newly acquired blade. He asserts that if he emerges victorious, he will personally present this blade to him. All are astonished by what the main character had stated, and when the young woman was on the verge of intervening, when Idrian remarked that she holds far greater worth than that blade, believing that the worth of a swordmaster cannot be equated to a tool such as that. Next, the fellow with the hair agrees to the wager, stating his name is Dunran of the Fahrenheit lineage, is on the verge of attaining the trifecta current, according to Idrian. That ultimately signifies he is a dual presence, and the individual, enraged, states that this was the 17th blade crafted by the artisan referred to as the swordmaster. Should he emerge victorious, this sword will be yours, your majesty. Upon hearing this, Idrian remarks that it is merely a coincidence, and begins to unsheath his armament. He states that as it occurs that he possesses a blade bestowed upon him by that mentor. This is the expert's centennial creation, but the individual claims he has never encountered any whispers suggesting he crafted a blade of that kind. Nonetheless, Idrian indicates that this task was finalized merely a few days prior, and the serviceman, calling upon his mana, the current asserts that despite your highness treading the misguided route of the blade, he recognizes unwavering determination in each of your strides and emerges from acknowledgement for that. He will exert his utmost in this battle thereafter. Idrian claims he's merely babbling, yet it creates no distinction, as this was never a location he could have regarded as his from the outset, proclaiming that the admiration directed toward him merely requires to originate from his own community, and invoking his mana core, he requests Adelia to observe intently, because that route is the path she must traverse henceforth, accompanied by sound. That the young lady begins to radiate, once more declaring her assurance. She shall proceed as your majesty desires. Shortly, the setting transitions to a different location, and Valahard inquires how many occasions they have previously visited the Iron Lion Castle, and the individual next to him responds that it's a total of 4. The 4th prince has no inclination towards the crown, so he would certainly avoid going there. As for the 3rd and 5th nobles arrived while the initial prince was confined to his residence, and the subsequent prince visited shortly thereafter. Nonetheless, it is inconsequential. Regardless of how tarnished his reputation may have been, it was indisputable that the eldest prince prince would be the legitimate successor to the kingdom. However, for matters to have arrived at this juncture, his obligation is likewise substantial. If he, the leader, had backed the primary prince, even slightly, he would not be so alone in questioning why he is behaving as his guardian presently, and the individual believes there is no falsehood in those statements, as he indeed betrayed his nephew when he once was someone who possessed a higher likelihood of evolving into a despot rather than an ineffective leader. There was even the occasion when he scolded him for being inebriated from a malevolent concoction, and the rascal, astonishingly, charged at him wielding a sword. No way that's possible. This initial prince was essentially a fool, utterly inept rascal, and upon his return to the north, disheartened, his nephew dispatched him toxic wine. He even possessed the audacity to label it a blessing, as he was consumed by flames. Eliminate the inexpensive toxin of questionable provenance along with the manna he also incinerated. What scant fondness he still retained for that lad, yet that rogue he believed would remain constant ultimately did the contrary. Unexpectedly, he found himself suffering rigorous training and has been developing progressively each day. Then the individual inquires if it weren't Valahard himself who had explicitly declared that the initial prince ought never to ascend to the throne but my companion. His uncle had already altered his perspective, believing that the individual the child is today bears no connection to who he was previously inquiring of him, to afford the young man an opportunity so that he might at least commence from the same position as the other princes, including Valahard. Begins pleading, and naturally the man was at a loss for words, alluding to that he is uncertain if it was he who transformed or the initial prince at that precise instant. A warrior unfastens the entrance, and goodness, I can already inform that this will not be favorable. Shortly after, the two individuals were strolling through the castle when the man beside him remarked that there was no need for such heightened anxiety, as his troops were well aware of their own boundaries. He assured that regardless of how fierce the confrontation might be, he would never allow a member of the royal lineage to be rendered unconscious. However, the man responded, at this moment, it's not the prince he ought to be concerned with, but rather his knight. And there you have it, my friend. It unfolded precisely as he predicted, seemingly out of thin air. The individual is propelled through the air. The gentleman was utterly shattered on the surface, and all were astonished that his majesty had triumphed once more. The individual next to him was unable to comprehend the situation, and Valahard stated that he had previously mentioned it prior to the protagonist. Doesn't pause for even a solitary moment, and elevating his blade he instructs the subsequent individual to advance. Next, a recollection emerges with the main character continuing to battle the individual with short hair, contemplating that his present. The combat poem is insufficient, and naturally, he was unable to employ the Dragon Slayer's verse against a mere knight, particularly at such a youthful age. A man engages his mana core, contemplating that his physique no longer resembles his own, and astonishingly that the identical sensation from that time was reoccurring. The child was essentially transitioning into a realm of heightened focus, and at that precise moment, their blades collide and revert. To this day, the individual was genuinely propelled through the air, indicating that time only flows once. Once more, and Adrian continued to conquer each military personnel who materialized before about him shortly thereafter. It was nearly dusk, and the lad had defeated a significant portion of the knights. He starts to recount a contest verse, and the mechanism alerts him that he succeeded in incorporating a new stanza into it that had transformed from a verse of lament transforms into an ode of conflict. At that precise instant, the lad was approximately to swoon, but a single. The knights assist him by stating that he sought to honor the triumph achieved by your majesty, as all the knights pay their homage. The main character who fails to comprehend. Everyone believed that only a moment prior, they were on the brink of tearing him to shreds, while Valahard and the other individual observed everything from a distance, with the man stating that they are inherently uncomplicated individuals, remarking that nothing thrills them any longer except the blade, and triumph immediately following that. Valahard indicates that based on his expression, he likely anticipated incurring the animosity of those troops, yet a loss holds greater value than an unclean triumph. Ultimately, success or failing is irrelevant, and listening to Adrian considers that he had assumed all his knowledge had been lost alongside mana's essence, yet it appears that at least one solitary aspect remained unaltered despite the setback. For triumph, the essence of the knight endures even as time elapses, and Adrian appeared to be heading back to his realm, expressing his wish that they would reconvene at a later time with all matters resolved. The lad was on the verge of entering the carriage when he suddenly shouts for the tally, requesting that they retain confidential the events that transpired during his visit, and Willowden inquires if revealing it to the public might not be beneficial for his majesty, to which he replies that this situation will ultimately ultimately vary from everything he desired, to execute a practical joke on a specific individual shortly thereafter. The troops were preparing to take a break, and Carl remarks that he will survey the environment while Arwen quietly observed our young man. She did not appear particularly content, and Idrian believes that she will eventually acclimate as well. Regardless, he ought to take a break as well, correct? And when he arrives, the canvas structure Adelia occupied, along with the child who remained with her, not entirely grasped it, believing he had undoubtedly enlisted an S-rank prodigy, yet she was still performing menial tasks. However, the unfortunate fellow simply desires to relax at this moment, and shortly thereafter Adelia inquires if anything is troubling him. However, he responds that all is well. Contemplating the medal, the Lion Knights were markedly dissimilar from what he had envisioned when he utilized the evaluation ability. The swordsmanship aptitude of the majority of the knights seldom surpassed grade B, yet historically they would have scarcely attained the median standard, and even after enduring a lifetime of rigorous training, they were mere commoners who would have perished without purpose. However, the individuals of the present era have attained a proficiency comparable to that of a swordsman in merely 20 or 30 years. In brief, the skills, the abilities of superhumans had diminished significantly, whereas those of ordinary individuals had surged dramatically. This is likely due to of the mana flow, and his relative is an individual who in earlier times may have attained transcendence, which is the reason he was so discontented to observe him squandering that potential. Nonetheless, this period is one where there exists not even the prospect of achieving accomplishments beyond an exceptional level. Ultimately, it was completely the shortcomings of the current age, and he must concede that he is not well acquainted with this period. Consequently, he will need to reassess everything from the outset, and immediately thereafter Valahard manifests, proclaiming that this is the correct mindset. It is not too late yet, and if he exerts himself diligently from this point forward, he will be capable of realizing the aspiration he has already attained. Concerning the Iron Lions, noting that if it had been different princes, they would struggle to coexist with them so effortlessly, indicating that Idrian made an exceedingly prudent choice. What is this? This individual is being excessively kind. It feels unusual. The main character did not comprehend anything, pondering what occurred with his uncle. He even inquires if he had lost his mind. Nevertheless, his uncle inquires if he does not recall the terms of the wager he had established with him, which fundamentally was concerning vanquishing a dual current knight, and he shall fulfill his pledge, declaring that Valahard, the leader of the 3rd Legion, will formally endorse the royal heir upon learning of our young man's situation. Is immediately astonished, eager to discover when precisely he had declared that he aspired to be monarch, and thus time elapsed, and my companion, your uncle's proclamation struck the realm like an explosion, with everyone extending their felicitations. The child, and amidst all that tumult, our protagonist, was present. He states that the location is a chaos, requesting them to dismiss everyone. However, Carl responds that they arrived by sovereign decree, thus they will remain even if he commands them to depart. If such is the situation, Idrian requests that they be removed from his view, and a short while afterward the young lad was relaxing for a little, but it endured merely a brief interval, and at that precise instant his sibling emerges, stating that he had taken action behind his back for following that he covertly acquired the art of swordsmanship from Count Valahard. But my companion, he committed a dreadful error, and that is the reason he will ensure he suffers significantly for belittling him. Nonetheless, the main character hardly knew how to react to that. After all, he had never desired anything related to the crown, correct? At that precise instant, a recollection emerges featuring Idrian stating that he will go along with this for the time being, but he ought to clarify that he has no desire to be involved with anything related to the throne, inquiring why he initiated it in the first place. This without even conferring with him, and upon hearing that, Valahard inquires whether he is concerned about him, since he is fundamentally the barrier that safeguards the realm from the creatures of the northern peaks. Nevertheless, as long as the monarchy and the aristocrats do not overlook the severity of winter, the residents will be well regardless. It was merely a question of time before this occurred, sooner or later, inquiring if he genuinely does not understand the destiny of a firstborn heir who does not receive the crown, and that circumstances will not alter merely due to his continued concealment. Should he require time to come to terms with the truth, he will be afforded as much as needed, yet he must remain cognizant that the authenticity of the oldest son will not vanish unless he passes away. Following that entire discussion, his uncle exits the chamber, and Idrian asserts that regardless of the duration afforded to him, he will not alter his perspective. After all, what he truly must restore his dominance and influence that had escalated to a higher plane, so it is not due to his desire something akin to the entitlement of inheritance, or at the very least that's what he believed correct. And amidst of that gathering, our lad makes his entrance into the venue, and immediately you could sense that the ambience was rather unpleasant. The focus was upon the main character, and all gaze upon him, and there was even a cloaked silhouette observing him, and that's how the feast commenced, and I can't shake this ominous sense that something dreadful is about to transpire. Idrian is heading down the staircase and surveying the surroundings in amazement. If these truly are the realm's aristocrats, the most amusing aspect is that they all possess the serpent heart characteristic, which is a sign of those who plunder and disregard the lives of others without a second thought are truly the only individuals of value. Observing that small assembly at the forefront as the master of ceremonies proceeds to welcome Taylor, he suggests that they ought to have conversed earlier, considering that even if he may lack exceptional skill, yet he is not dishonest. Regardless, that is sufficient already, and commencing today, they will act as conduits for sowing the seeds. What sort of narrative is this? At that precise instant, a military personnel emerges stating that the ambassador, Collion de Bourgogne Montpellier, is approaching. What an astonishingly difficult name it is. Instantly, everyone submits to the elderly gentleman who is undoubtedly elevated. Prestigious aristocrat, then, the gentleman declares it's been an extended period, and upon receiving that information, the lad appears astonished simultaneously. A recollection surfaces with Idrian contemplating that this is the individual they battled against for an extensive duration of 400 years, a name that has echoed through countless generations. Blemishes on this nation, and yet he had the audacity to present himself before him at that precise instant. A dignitary unexpectedly stumbles, and in doing so, utterly drenches the host. The individual then expresses his regrets, and Idrian, merely gazing at the aristocrat, indicates that it's acceptable to modify the topic. He inquires of Karl regarding the identity of the individual who claims to be Marcus. Bielefeld subsequently states it. Idrian remarks, "It appears that not all individuals are entirely corrupt," and as a result, his temper subsided somewhat after a few moments. The host was cleansing his visage, and subsequently his relative seems gazing at his countenance, uttering that Marcus Bielefeld remarked that he appeared as though he was on the verge of creating chaos. Seemingly, he wasn't expressing anything. Absurdity and fellow. The host is nearly unraveling as his uncle inquires what he intended to act, and in response, he asserted that he wasn't that foolish. However, there was one aspect he couldn't comprehend. The malevolent dwelling of Burgundy displays its might directly in the center of the realm, and the aristocrats honor them more than the monarchy itself. There was an excess of admiration, stressed to deem it tranquility, and excessively unilateral a connection to label it a coalition, inquiring how on earth the nation has reached this stage. His uncle remarks, there is no notably exceptional narrative referencing that. Historically, as the realm withstood numerous incursions from the empire, the knights emerged to fend off the adversary. Nevertheless, as time went on, the dominion continued to expand, and the chasm between them merely broadened. Encountering an empire that had transformed into a superpower, the realm ultimately found itself with no alternative but to submit. Upon hearing that, Idrian instantly considers it was likely due to that, even though being a tiny nation situated on the periphery of the continent, the realm possessed a quality that enabled it to withstand that formidable empire since the inception of the state. Accomplishments had accumulated along with legends, and one must not overlook the poem of the knights. Nevertheless, all of that was misplaced, and immediately thereafter, the main character asserts he has altered his decision, announcing that he now desires to ascend to the throne. Valahard is astonished, and Idrian believes he might lament it, yet it's an action he must undertake. Ultimately, he had constructed almost 50% of this nation with his own efforts. A brief time afterward, our champion makes his way back to the feast and surveys the surroundings. The aristocrats appear to be concerned about something. Idrian believes this manners are so careless that they wouldn't remotely resemble the respect afforded to a foreign aristocrat in earlier times. When his companion stood in front of his community, no one anticipated he would ascend to the throne. After all, he was inconsequential, beyond just a rural lad from an isolated hamlet, and nonetheless, the individual advanced before the crowd. Precisely the manner in which he is currently acting, the young lad subsequently commences to deliver the verses of the knights in front of all, believing that it is comparable to the verse of the dragon conqueror. This one is tolerable, yet nonetheless, there is nothing superior opportunity than this for the current circumstances. Suddenly, a tiara and cloak materialized on the child. At that precise instant, everyone begins to gaze with our lad, and without any delay, they ultimately yield, and that's significantly improved, remarks Idrian. They are able to lift their heads now, yet at that identical instant, the lad perceives a distinct type of vitality and gazes towards. Beside him, he notices the cloaked girl as she removes her hood, and indeed, the young woman is an elf who claims she was astonished that an individual still recalled the knightly verses. It appears that Idrian does to acknowledge this lady, contemplating how that madman was there the most stunning, a formation molded by divine beings, and a benevolent species that cherishes even the tiniest existence, the cultivators of the woodland who reside for a minimum of 300 years and may attain up to a millennium. This is the perception humans hold of elves, yet in truth they are a ruthless society that employs allure as a lure to bring their adversaries to the downfall of the noble elves. Those who are born at a hero level are even more perilous among them, particularly the individual who is standing before you stands not merely an ordinary high elf, but a creature who possesses, resided for almost a millennium, an ancient noble elf known as Sigrun, and she is a participant in the venture that vanquished the enraged dragon 4 centuries ago in history. The young woman became fixated on acquiring the main character after her mentor was slain, contemplating whether she had, by any possibility, identified him immediately afterward. The girl inquires if they have encountered each other previously, as he seems somewhat recognizable, and Idrian, without delay, merely nods his head, stating that it belongs to him. Upon encountering an elf for the first time, the girl remains fixated in her gaze. Regarding our protagonist, who believes that Sigrun was already among the most formidable beings of her epoch during the Sword Age 4 centuries prior, he cannot even begin to fathom the type of beast she has transformed into now. Immediately thereafter, she remarks that it is said humans respond to elves in 2 manners upon encountering them for the first time. The majority of mortals succumb to their allure, be enticed, yet there exist individuals who have attained a degree of expertise that keeps them vigilant, yet from what she can observe, your majesty continues, does not appear to have attained that status. Then Idrian remarks that he merely possesses distinct aesthetic preferences. Thus naturally, the young woman, upon hearing that, she was bound to feel anxious, wasn't she? And placing her with her hood drawn over her head, she remarks that it was a delight to encounter him, albeit briefly, before she ultimately departs, and subsequently Idrian believes that he has endured, at least for the moment, a brief period later, a multitude of young women were arriving for the main character to select from, and indeed there's even a youngster present. No one could claim that disarray any longer, and his mother remarks that an impending princess ought to be sagacious, moral, and possess numerous additional qualities. I could no longer endure the elderly woman's chatter, and immediately thereafter, a soldier announces that the elven delegation has sought a meeting at that precise moment. The cloaked girl from earlier materializes, stating that Sigrun, of the mistletoe lineage, salutes our stunning sovereign Margarita. I have only recently discovered this woman's name, and she claims it possesses. It has been an exceptionally lengthy period since the elves graced the kingdom, which is indeed astonishing. Sigrun remarks that it appears your majesty is in search of a consort for the prince, inquiring if that is accurate as she lowers her hood. She proclaims that she is a noble elf, and in human standards, one might assert that she is descended from a time-honored aristocratic heritage, and astonishingly, her age is quite similar to yours, your highness. Wow, I can already observe what is about to unfold, my friend. She learned that elves, who maintain their allure for such an extended period, are perfect companions for humans. Observe, my friend, what did I mention? Indeed, from the instant she beheld the prince, she sensed that the destiny of the pair had converged. This is extending far too much immediately. The young lad is astonished, pondering that elves never deceive when discussing destiny, questioning whether that was genuine. Hears that, astonished, and subsequently everyone in the corridor begins conversing about it, seeking to ascertain its veracity. Therefore, Idrian, without expending time, grabs the girl by the hand, expressing that they need to talk solo swiftly, and shortly thereafter, Idrian shouts out to her, inquiring her to articulate her genuine aim, and she asserts it was solely to enhance the bonds between her clan and the realm. Nevertheless, Idrian contends he is about to inquire of the high elf Sigrun once more regarding the executioner, who for centuries has borne the weight of her people's massacre, and the blade of the Mistletoe clan, inquiring whether her goal there is inquiry or even implementation at that precise instant. The young woman's demeanor shifts as she inquires how he possesses such extensive knowledge about her, and Idrian, observing intently, quietude, believes that she is a creature whose power in its present form is immeasurable, and if she perceived a fate within him, which signifies that she holds a caliber sufficient to faintly perceive the history etched upon his spirit immediately following that. The girl asserts that he is aware she is an executioner, yet still fails to grasp how foolish it is to remain silent in her presence. However, the boy cautions that he comprehends quite well, as he also recognizes that excessive chatter before an executioner is just as senseless. Regardless, she must halt this chaos, urging her not to meddle in his fate, believing that at this instant she can only experience intrigue towards him, and should this persist, the trifling fate of a human will be squandered in the grasp of a mad elf. If that proves true, he must elicit heightened intrigue, and then Sigrun inquires about his true identity. He responds that at this moment, he is merely a pitiable royal who has been forsaken even by his his own progenitor, and if she is inquisitive concerning anything, she merely needs to be patient and observe. Upon hearing that, the young woman is astonished by stating that she realized there was something peculiar. After all, they wouldn't assign her such a foolish task, but now she comprehends that everything stemmed from him, and the unfortunate main character, merely wishing to depart, perceives that she remains a highly unsettling individual. Shortly thereafter, the setting shifts back to the monarch's chamber and individual, the pair of they were clasping hands as they stood in front. The monarch and Adrian declare he possesses something to announce, indicating that he will embrace the commitment with the young woman. This is escalating from 0 to 100 far too swiftly, considering that he never envisioned the moment would arrive when he would utter that young woman's name with such intimacy. It holds far too much significance. A concern for them to determine so promptly, so he will merely monitor the circumstances for the time being, contemplating that. For the monarch, it will be an extended duration for them to contemplate, whereas for Sigrun, it will merely be the period in which he will be developing, and for him, it will be essential moment to acquire sufficient vigor to break free from this frenzied elf. Shortly thereafter, the focus transitions to the other prince, who, infuriated, proclaims that the sole benefit the main character possesses over him is the cursed inheritance. Not too long ago, his uncle unexpectedly announced his backing for him and subsequently seized the blossom of the Iron Lion stronghold, and now the individual is pursuing that elf regardless. It holds no discrepancy, as he has a confrontation arranged with him shortly. The individual lacked considerable benevolent aspirations, and a short while afterwards, the instant of the confrontation had ultimately come. Astonishingly swift, our lad remained completely composed, and subsequently the alternative. The prince claims he has made extensive preparations and even invited a few onlookers, inquiring whether his sibling genuinely enjoyed it. He sincerely hopes so. He will not let down the audience's anticipations, and Adrian states he had observed it previously, but he truly converses excessively, which irritated others. The impudent child lunges directly towards Adrian simultaneously, who remarks that previously he initially intended to jest with him briefly, but ultimately he found himself getting extremely occupied. Recently, the unfortunate fellow stumbles to the earth within mere moments, as all observe. In astonishment, the same applies to the other evening, contemplating whether this is truly the initial prince he is acquainted with. Having everything arranged, the victor of the confrontation has already been announced, and Adrian squanders no moment and departs from that location immediately. After a while, whispers started to circulate that Prince Gilhan had been defeated by Adrian. Shortly thereafter, the youth awakens, requesting them to organize his gear as he returns to determine the victor. Wow, this individual truly perseveres. In the meantime, the previous evening, news emerged that the prince departed the metropolis alongside Count Valahard right after the confrontation, stating his intention to head north, where the Valahard household resides on the path to the sanctified location. Valahard claims he has become quite proficient at horseback riding, and Adrian remarks that it isn't particularly difficult, correct? Shifting the topic, he inquired about the reason behind his urgency, considering the feast concluded just recently, and he ought to recuperate for several days. Adrian asserts that there is no space for him in the capital, and he has no desire to remaining alongside individuals who fail to acknowledge the sovereign of their own nation and continue to fawn over the empire's lackeys. Furthermore, he integrates far more seamlessly with the knights than with the aristocrats, and his uncle asserts that while they lack the scheming nature of the nobles, they are significantly more traditional in their ways. They maintain that tedious dialogue, and his uncle remarks he cannot shake the sensation that he is being exceedingly reckless, and Adrian believes that if he ultimately takes an excessive amount of time, he'll wed that madwoman, and historically, all who have done so met their demise. He must acquire power prior to that occurring to accelerate his development. There exists a particular location to gain strength, the site where everyone, humans, are pushed to their extremes and where the majority of warriors versus emerged, and that is evidently the combat zone, correct? In response, Valahard remarks that these lowlands are the cutting peaks and the boundary his lineage has safeguarded throughout their existence, while the central character was trembling from the chill, stating he would possess to acclimate quickly and glance to the side. Arwen was present as well, appearing to be chilly. Adrian inquires about her well-being, and she replies that she is doing well. Adrian mentions that if it becomes challenging, she can exchange roles with someone at any moment. However, she states that there is no possibility for a knight to pursue individual solace, and Adrian believes it is beneficial that there is at least one person brimming with enthusiasm. On the contrary, others are expressing dissatisfaction concerning being compelled to go there under regal directives. If Carl's were in that instance, he would have already confronted them. And then a reminiscence surfaces featuring the monarch declaring that the royal knights are not merely his private retainers. Fundamentally, accidentally, that's the reason. Carls was unable to journey north alongside them, and even if this physique has committed numerous errors, yet it remains his own kin nevertheless. The monarch's demeanor appears somewhat extravagant, and there undoubtedly exists a narrative lurking beneath it. Shortly thereafter, Valahard urges them to quicken their momentum, for if not, they will find themselves ensnared in the heart of the tempest while time continues to elapse. And Valahard instructs them to abandon the carriages and simply mount the horses, proceeding on foot. Idrian contemplates the individual, even utilized mana to call out, and then our protagonist requests for Adelia and assisting the young woman in descending at. Simultaneously, Arwen materializes, inquiring whether he was fine while the tempest was intensifying increasingly, and Idrian began to become extremely enraged, instructs Arwen to look after Adelia, commanding the foolish individuals to lower their defenses. Something along those lines will solely result in the breeze whisking them off, compelling them to relinquish all burdensome items save for their blades. Each stride amidst the tempest felt exceedingly cumbersome, and to exacerbate the situation, all individuals were already fatigued. Certain individuals were beginning to lag. Idrian, making his way back to the forefront, lifts the individual who had collapsed to the earth and begins to carry him. This individual is a powerhouse. They continue advancing in the direction of the destination they aspired to attain, and ultimately they discover the stronghold. The most humorous aspect is the wretched tempest had ceased solely when they reached that location, and the heavens even resolved as though the tempest had been a mere mirage. At that moment, Valahard advances before the entrance, declaring that as the sovereign of that region and leader of the realm's 3rd Legion greets the eldest prince as the young boy surveys his surroundings, entirely joyful, along with his uncle, greets him at Winter Castle. Winter Castle is a stronghold situated in the extreme northern region of the realm, serving as a bastion against creatures and designed to defend against them for regular infantry. It is the most unfavorable position imaginable, and aristocrats from globally might endeavor to evaluate the political standing of Winter Castle. Nonetheless, for individuals who were born and nurtured in that location, it represents a locale that transforms into the responsibility and honor of a lifetime. Next, the individual present there claims his name is Vicente, and from this day forward, he will conclude his responsibilities as interim commander and resume his role as commander of the Ranger Company, expressing his happiness. His progenitor had come back unharmed, and Valahard remarks that he performed exceptionally well. Neither I nor the main character might find it hard to accept, inquiring whether his uncle had a child, and now that he considered it, they truly resembled one another, and to complicate things further, their temperaments were alike as well. Immediately following that, Valahard presents the main character, declaring that this is Prince Idrian. Alongside the lad, bowing, proclaims his name is Vicente from the Valahard lineage. Gazing down at him, Idrian expresses that it is a delight to encounter him, and Vicente, furious, believes that the Winter Castle is a stronghold of regal fighters who jeopardize their lives for honorable principles and not a sight for a fool who was expelled from the metropolis to roam about with feminine belongings. Circumstances had already unfolded. Commencing with misconceptions, the individual remained curious about the reason for his father's presence there once more, inquiring of him what on earth was happening. He remarked, expressing that upon hearing the news, he resolved to become the youth's guide and that he would be residing in the realm for the time being. Confused by the situation, his son inquired if he hadn't forsaken the young man due to his foolishness. Upon hearing that, the elderly gentleman averts his gaze, remarking that individuals are fated to transform, so there exists solely one matter he wishes to inquire about, therefore he ought to attempt to witness our lad devoid of any bias. As time elapses, Valahard inquires about the progress of eliminating creatures from the settlements, to which Vincent responds that they has been consistently decreasing the figures, yet there remain certain areas that are still ambiguous. Now that his father has come, they will take action while our young man continues to observe the dialogue and the individual beyond. It is stated that the existing issue involves the orcs, a minor faction of fewer than 20 have established themselves at the gateway to the mountain range, and at that scale it would be challenging for the rangers to engage using merely arrows, which is why they are making a selection. Cavalry at the fortress, and Idrian slices into the dialogue, indicating that he will attend to this chaos. The individual next to him indicates that the orcs inhabiting the mountainous region are unlike typical orcs, and should complications arise, there may be issues with the ranger's mission. Upon hearing this, Idrian then contacts his uncle, who inquires of his son what the dimensions and power of the validated orcs have to date reached. A maximum of 20 have been observed, and while the presence of an orc fighter or mystic hasn't been verified, the potential for their existence cannot be dismissed. Immediately following that, Valahard inquires if Idrian was assured, and promptly Vincent Vincent asserts that the entry point is one of the primary pathways utilized by the Rangers, and should it transform into a conflict zone, forthcoming efforts will be significantly more challenging in the event of any issues. With the prince's security, Valahard's stance will likewise become challenging, and upon hearing all of this, Idrian contemplates that his uncle has indeed fostered a remarkably astute heir as they persist with the procedure of arranging the approach, and Vincent appeared rather displeased about it shortly thereafter. Our protagonist was relaying the information to his knights, indicating that he had been entrusted with the task of conquering the orcs, noting that the adversary count stood at 20. The individual nearby attempted to fabricate a pretext, asserting that his duty was solely to accompany the prince. However, Idrian responded affirmatively, stating that this was advantageous, as they would need to accompany him in order to ensure the prince's safety. With all matters resolved, the youthful individual departs, pondering that regardless of whether he appreciates it or not, they are the troops allocated to him, so he must instruct them to become competent. They did not appear particularly dependable. Upon initial observation, however, as they were the distinguished few chosen by the family, they possessed commendable abilities, even though certain individuals appeared dubious given their expertise in interrogation and subterfuge. Correct? Shortly thereafter, the individual who would lead the central character, Vicente himself, who remarks that the prince may be unaware that if this endeavor falters, he will encounter a more formidable challenge than he anticipates. The two remain there in that spirited competition, and at that precise instant, a mechanism manifests for Idrian, notifying him that it is unfeasible to observe the status window, and immediately Idrian surmises that the individual is at minimum a triple chain knight, being one of the individuals behind them include a genuine ranger, while the others are knights masquerading as typical rangers. They likely have ulterior motives to manage matters independently if required, yet he intends to disregard that as they are unfamiliar with him, and without dawdling, the operation was poised to commence as time elapses. Vicente remarks, they should tread carefully while preserving as much stamina as they can, and if their energy depletes, their extremities will become numb, hindering their ability to combat effectively. The individual continues to speak, and Idrian believes the child is even more loquacious than his own father at that precise moment. They perceive a sound, and one of the troops, without delay, seizes a telescope, observing that there were additional orcs in front. Those creatures over there appeared rather unwelcoming, and the soldier inquires how they intended to advance, and naturally, my companion, they intended to rush in simultaneously, correct? And at that precise instant, one of the orcs observes their arrival, and the entire group gazes intently at the main character, who believes it has been an extended duration. Simultaneously, a multitude of projectiles are directed at the creatures that are hit by them. Concurrently, the young lad unsheathes his blade and vaults over one. Amidst the assaults, he thrusts his sword into that creature. He believes that this was what he had consistently yearned for. After all, the war zone is his existence. At that precise instant, Arwen emerges, cautioning that it is perilous, yet he instructs her not to meddle as the young man maintains his sword aloft, believing that beyond, for centuries ago, the orcs were not beasts but rather esteemed sovereigns of the continent. This is no fabrication or tale of valor narrative, yet there was the melody of a destitute individual who despised the orcs, prompting Idrian to utilize one from those gallant verses once more, and lo, an immense presence materializes. In the heavens, the young lad was prepared for confrontation. At that precise instant, a recollection emerges as the auburn-haired woman remarks, he learned that individuals perish readily at Winter Castle, yet the man reassures him not to be concerned, as there will be no motive for conflict, inquiring about his thoughts on that. Ineffectual royal is set to venture there, and he will undoubtedly remain confined within the fortress, attempting to usurp the accomplishments of his maternal uncle, the most significant of which it isn't him, but rather his uncle, and all he must do is observe the Winter Castle's activities and inform him if anything unusual occurs, along with providing updates. A pouch of cash, he inquires whether he can proceed with that. The man, brimming with self-assurance, affirms certainly he is capable, yet returning to the current moment, it's the total antithesis. The conflict is still underway, and the unfortunate fellow was quaking with fright, uncertain of what he ought to act. In his desperation, he lunges at one of the creatures, but he is swiftly overpowered. At that precise instant, Arwen emerges, overcoming the beast effortlessly. The massive creature descends to the earth, and the young woman states this is a war zone, and they must not let down their arms recklessly. The man acquiesces to it all, undoubtedly, yet there is no opportunity to pause for a moment to regain his composure, since the conflict was ongoing. Correct? Arwen instructs all the soldiers to ready themselves for conflict, believing that their figures are considerably substantial, and it appears that managing all of them with just the personnel they presently possess will be challenging. Nevertheless, my companion, at that precise instant, the blade penetrates the creature's torso as onlookers others observe that in astonishment, and indeed our protagonist was not joking, the child was correct. Amidst all those creatures, and he appeared not even the faintest hint of apprehension, and without delay, he rushes towards the other orcs as a recollection surfaces in his thoughts, proclaiming that irrespective of how on numerous occasions that individual excelled, yet it was still insufficient, and perpetually seeking for the adversary, he roamed across the desolate terrain ruled by the orcs. The energy within his soul had long ago exhausted their resources, yet still that accursed individual didn't pause, and with each stride as time passed, the man aged and became considerably frilier, the infernal blade within his hands were what propelled him forward, and for that elderly man's ultimate desire, he was expending the remainder of his life energy. He was merely another one of those individuals who, in his history, had bereaved of his spouse and offspring due to that competition, fundamentally merely another one of those relentless cycles of retribution, and ultimately, when he encountered the adversary of his existence, regrettably, he was already thoroughly shattered. Nevertheless, he moved forward toward the being, but clearly it was not sufficient conclusion to that damned loop. Immediately collapsed. The gentleman, already burdened by the passage of years, had descended to the earth, yet still he had not surrendered until the conclusion that was merely another one. A tale that remained untold to anyone, and that no individual ever understood how he was once a blade in those times. He shall be the sole one to recall all of that and return to the present. All the orcs had already been vanquished, at the very least on the location where the main character resided, indeed my companion, for on the opposing front, all were still fighting fiercely while Idrian maintained his position. Blade, he believes that he ultimately recalls to be more precise. It's the purported poem of retribution which is, in any case, an incomplete melody. He must complete the cursed stanza without delay. He continues moving forward against those orcs without pausing. Our protagonist was entirely concentrated in the theater of war, and the system alerts him that an additional stanza has been incorporated into the poem of retribution, and articulating the accursed verse, he states that he remains prior to those creatures to pay tribute to that individual spirit. The system notifies him that the poem of retribution has transformed into a dirge. Glancing aside, the conflict had ultimately concluded, and Vincent, shattering a banner, proclaims that the orcs were utterly obliterated. Triumph belonged to them, and Idrian inquires whether that fellow above, the individual from earlier wasn't referred to as Vincent, squandered his existence in the past, yearning for the obliteration of the orcs, and to consider that this individual shares the same name as that person is quite a coincidence, since that elderly man claims that in his subsequent life he will undoubtedly eradicate that species. Shortly thereafter, Vincent, grasping the crimson banner, requests the main character to accept it, as it is a custom of his battalion that the soldier who performed most admirably is entitled to claim the adversary's standard, essentially a symbol of triumph that is irreplaceable, and its possessor would particularly. Immediately afterward, Arwen addresses Your Majesty, expressing her admiration for his remarkable courage and valor in combat. Suddenly, all the troops kneel before him, while the young boy observes the scene in awe. Joyfully hoisting the flag, he proclaims that they had prevailed against those orcs, and thus all the troops ultimately recognize our champion, greeting him at the winter fortress sincerely. The child was truly delighted that he had received that banner proclaiming him its legitimate possessor, and immediately after, Vincent, brimming with self-satisfaction, boasts that he has 16 of them. Astonishingly, it has transformed into a rivalry. Witnessing this, Idrian observes quietly, and then, disregarding Vincent entirely, asserts once more that the banner rightfully belongs to him. A few moments later, everyone began to settle down, the orc encampment ablaze, and Vincent remarks that in light of they battled the superior orc warrior squad, and the fatalities were relatively few. Arwen asserts that despite this, it remains unfortunate, and Vincent asserts that triumph is homage sufficient for the deceased, providing solace to their souls. The lifeless with the essence of their adversaries is the way the Valahard lineage operates, and upon hearing that, our lad instantly appears to acknowledge that youthful individual, pondering whether he might be the rebirth of that individual. Immediately thereafter, he inquires whether the Third Legion had consistently been trailing them in this manner, and the individual, devising a rationale, explains that they merely encountered a contingent of rangers in proximity, prompting them to unite. Idrian remarks that it's quite an astonishing coincidence, yet naturally, the child isn't likely to accept that, assuming that seemingly Vincent lacked confidence in him and orchestrated this covertly. Correct? Then Vincent remarks that it is peculiar that a distinguished orc battalion ventured all the way to the base of the mountain, and yet none of the scouts noticed their presence. Regardless, the finest, an alternative would be to head back to the fortress, and shortly thereafter, they had already come back, and Valahard remarked that they had performed exceptionally well in commending them. Upon Upon returning safely, Idrian remained completely thrilled because he had obtained that banner. Wow, it's becoming rather tedious to observe that. The troops claim he was already undertaking it for the 11th occasion, yet my companion, the young man, was merely overlooked. Vincent informs his. The paternal figure noted that the orc battalion emerged much sooner than anticipated. Perhaps they had discovered some substantial quarry or an incident occurred in the mountains. Frankly, neither scenario boded well for them. Immediately thereafter, his father expressed a desire to allow him some respite, but the circumstances were pressing, urging him to accompany him for the time being. Everyone began to proceed into the fortress, and simultaneously, Vincent gazes at our protagonist, remarking on his execution. Was remarkable to listen to that. The lad fails to comprehend anything, inquiring if he considers himself somewhat peculiar, and Arwen responds affirmatively. It's due to his aloof nature, and he likely felt uncomfortable adjusting his demeanor so abruptly at that particular instant. Adelia seems joyful that he reached his destination safely. Now you already understand what's about to unfold, correct? And the child, selecting hoist the banner once more, inquires if she comprehends what this signifies. My goodness, I can no longer endure this. Then moments elapse, and Vincent mentions that within a few days, a reconnaissance team will be assembled to assess the circumstances in the mountains, which remain uncertain, will occur in that location, and they intend to choose exclusively distinguished individuals capable of adeptly navigating the mountains. Consequently, the sovereign does not require participation in this endeavor, prompting the main character to inquire as to the reason. He entered his chamber to inform him of what had already been expressed during the gathering, and the lad asserts that the leader had explicitly commanded it. At that moment, Idrian comprehends that his uncle was likely attempting to foster a bond between them, though to be honest, that isn't particularly challenging, is it? After dismissing the individual, the youth found himself lost in contemplation, gazing once more at that banner. Please refrain from initiating this. Once more, he believes that within. During that conflict, he was profoundly engaged, and it marked his initial occasion of delivering an epic poem in its entirety. He is likely to undergo comparable items in the forthcoming times. The verses he possesses are not precisely. Nonetheless, he needed to claim them as his own at that precise instant. Our young lad perceives a sound, and glancing sideways, he spots a small bird beside the window. Yet my companion, who minor detail failed, appear quite amicable, doesn't it? Idrian believes it's evident who had dispatched it, and concurrently, that object begins conversing, inquiring whether he appreciated the present she had dispatched. Idrian gazes at it in terror, inquiring whether that battalion, the presence of orcs that manifested at the base of the mountain, was due to her actions, and she claims that she merely sought to present your majesty with a rival deserving of your stature that I anticipated you would accept. This present is received with warmth, and Idrian believes that also. Following the deaths of numerous officers, she speaks as though nothing transpired. Elves delight in observing everything from a distance, and they must have relished witnessing the clash against the regiment of orcs that they had enticed to that location. So this is what they refer to as benevolence, and immediately following that, he urges her to cease procrastinating and express her desires. The girl responds that he is quite unfeeling, yet there's nothing that can be accomplished, as unreciprocated affection inevitably causes pain, so she will bide her time until the moment he reveals his emotions, whispering into the child's ear. She indicates that nestled within the mountain range, there exists something he must witness, an age-old entity, slumbering in those peaks, and if he seizes this opportunity, he could craft an exceptional poem in that precise instant. The tiny avian creature starts to distort, and the girl remarks that her bond was already dwindling at that moment. The tiny avian creature collapses lifeless, and Idrian contemplates that. The woman is infuriating until the very end. It is evidently obvious. What she desires ultimately is for him to compose a new valiant anthem, yet regardless, he remains participating in her activity, and shortly thereafter, Vincent remarks that the officers navigate in and out of the mountains as if it were their abode, yet still, they linger only at the periphery, for those who venture further do not come back. Their purpose is to thwart creatures. Upon descending the mountain, not primarily to investigate within it, Idrian subsequently inquires whether that implies no one is aware of what lies within there from the past. All the enigmas of the universe were deciphered by warriors in pursuit of elevation, yet that realm remained unblemished, and constitutes a form of taboo, correct? Regardless, now that he's evaluating the circumstances, it was quite beneficial to have visited that location, and immediately following that, Vincent states that merely as a precaution, they ought not to contemplate venturing further into those peaks. Idrian advises him to unwind, as he surely won't. However, my dear companion, you are well aware that, naturally, he will indeed go through with it, correct? Assuming that he won't, at least not for the moment. Observe, I mentioned it to you earlier. Shortly thereafter, Idrian, while polishing his blade, became curious about what lay within those mountains. It stirs a desire to venture out and discover immediately, yet he requires additional confrontations and additional triumphs. At that precise instant, Valahard sounds a trumpet, and instantly all present understands it was an assault all the warriors undertake their stances, and the main character emerges, at which point his relative remarks, "That is the location beyond the peaks where a few soldiers were descending." And Idrian ponders the reason. The scouts were retreating at that moment. My companion, a multitude of orcs emerges, mounted on wolves. Our protagonist senses that something is amiss, and his uncle remarks that those fiends ought to have overtaken them quite some time ago. The troops continue to press forward in the direction of the entrance, and the guard present declares that at this pace they will be annihilated. If that is the situation, he will remain and fend them off so his fellow soldiers can reach the fortress, and thus the unfortunate individual meets his end towards a more favorable location. Yet regrettably, even that did not suffice for his companions to ensure everyone survives. Was observing that circumstance from atop the barrier, and Valahard proclaims that all combatants, excluding the border patrol, were permitted to descend from the ramparts, while all the fighters observed the scenario with dismay, and Idrian inquired if he led him there solely to demonstrate that, and his uncle agrees, for it was all a ruse, and had he dispatched reinforcements, they too would have been consumed. Then Vincent makes his entrance, asserting that practicality is ineffective against creatures that remain indifferent to it. Their own existence and a prolonged conflict is precisely what they desire regardless. Winter has hardly initiated, thus they are unable to respond on a whim. At that precise instant, those creatures commence progressing towards the entrance, accompanied by one of the guards with a telescope in hand gazes at one of the troops, coming to the realization that he remained alive. Nevertheless, that does not alter the reality that numerous creatures continue to exist in Valahard. Observing the circumstance indicates that this victor is distinct from all the others, leading the protagonist to ponder whether that cursed elf is entangled as well. And at that precise instant, a different orc, mightier than the rest, seems the colossal beast permits, let out a deafening howl, and Vincent remarks on the creatures are poised to carry out his execution. Nonetheless, the main character, grasping the child by the shoulder, states that is incorrect. They are not announcing a implementation, more precisely, they are initiating a confrontation with that. Idrian promptly comprehends what that elf articulated regarding a primordial entity slumbering within those peaks, and unexpectedly, the creature begins to articulate, declaring that he will combat with integrity and reclaim the dignity of his battalion. All of this being accomplished for the magnificent monarch, Valahard inquires if he is asserting that those orcs have seized captives and are daring them to a confrontation. Idrian responds that this is precisely the case, yet neither of the two appears to accept his word. He states that if they choose not to trust him, he will demonstrate it firsthand, standing atop the battlement. Our protagonist declares that he embraces the challenge, and all present, aside from the contenders, must withdraw 200 steps and alight from the wolves. At that precise instant, the orc is taken aback, inquiring how a human is capable of articulating the dialect of his tribe, suspecting that he may possess the lineage of his kin. However, Idrian asserts that he does not discovered any of that. Inquiring about what he plans to do, the orc subsequently consents to express that if he has the audacity to tarnish in a noble confrontation, he will not excuse him. The main character subsequently inquires if they have some faith in him now, yet the two of them fail to grasp what he was conveying. However, my companion simultaneously they comprehended its essence. Ultimately, quite literally, every single orcs withdrew, leaving behind solely those who we are set to engage in a duel. As Valahard claims, he has dedicated countless hours of winters in that location but has never encountered anything akin to it, and Idrian states they will need to reserve their astonishment for another time. The demands of those scoundrels are straightforward: 5 contenders for the duel, but they must be selected from among those who participated in the conflict of the mountain range. With that, the assembly commences, arranging their approach, and Idrian, next to Arwen, states that 2 positions have already been occupied. The warriors are astonished, expressing that this is exceedingly perilous. However, the youth inquires who, apart from himself, could communicate with the orcs. Furthermore, he believes he couldn't turn down someone so enthusiastic. He then poses a question to Arwen. She is capable of accomplishing it swiftly, affirming that she certainly can. Moments later, Valahard inquires about his source of knowledge regarding the Orcish tongue, as he had spent his entire existence believing that those creatures lacked the ability to express themselves coherently. Idrian merely suggests that he delve deeper into his studies, assuming that only the aristocratic orcs possess such skills. Those who serve the chieftain of the tribe are capable of conversing in the archaic tongue, with all matters resolved. Everyone was on the verge of descending from the wall, and the assembly preparing to enter. The conflict was ultimately resolved. The individual mused that events are beginning to become become intriguing. There are not numerous coincidences in this realm, yet the instant he stepped into it, elven envoys, having never set foot in the realm, materialized unexpectedly, and for the first time in 4 centuries, the monarch of the orcs descended from the north. Truthfully, he is completely oblivious. What occurred but is no longer it's now the occasion to contemplate that, isn't it? The instant to battle has ultimately come, and the central character was experiencing a profound self-assurance. The monarch of the orcs observes. The main character in silence inquires whether he is his adversary, and Idrian questions if he didn't enjoy it, yet it's truly the exact contrary, as his essence is the most formidable of these individuals, and in addition, he is the most deserving. His physique must undoubtedly be exceptional. Finesse, and subsequently the main character expresses. It's amusing that the initial individual to identify him without any bias was an orc at that precise moment. Vincent remarks that matter is excessively powerful, requesting him to allow him to battle in his stead, yet he lacks the time for it. That ultimately he engaged in another battle, correct? Those creatures did not appear very prepared to converse, and the pair of them subsequently assume their combat postures. Idrian asserts that orcs do not linger to engage in combat like warriors. Instead, advance boldly towards the orc, instructs them to take any measures necessary to endure as time progresses. The conflict continues. Truly and frankly, it's unattainable to indicate who dominated as the main character delivers a strike concerning the orc monarch, yet it scarcely produced any impact. The creature laments that it is regrettable. He possesses such lamentable power for a being of his nature, and the child conjuring his energy. The heart indicates that they are departing now. To accomplish tasks correctly, an ambience encircles the whole battlefield, and Idrian believes that the feelings stirred by countless warriors mirrored those of that wrathful nomad who once traversed the fields, and the more he reflects on, the more assured he becomes about proceeding. Reaching that location was the correct decision, and by harnessing all his strength, he expresses gratitude to the creature for its patience, indicating that it will be of assistance. As a contribution to gain strength, the young one is not fooling around.